Chapter 26. Prelude to Destruction. To a casual observer of the Mormon scene in the spring of 1844, it must have seemed that Joseph Smith was riding higher than ever before. Except for the fulminations of the anti-Mormons at Warsaw and Carthage, there was little overt resentment against him or his people. His presidential campaign was winning him much publicity and, by lifting the Mormon vote out of party politics, seemed likely to mollify certain of the antagonisms arising from political issues. Actually, the enmity against the Mormons was widespread and dangerous. Those who took Joseph's campaign seriously saw him as an evil symbol of the union of church and state, and others suspected that he would eventually renounce his candidacy and declare for a popular candidate. The Masons, annoyed at rumors of corruption of the Masonic ritual in the Mormon lodges, which now numbered 5, 3 in Nauvoo and 2 in Iowa, and furious at Joseph's refusal to send the lodge records to Springfield for inspection, were determined to revoke the dispensations and declare all the Mormon lodges clandestine. This was done in the 1844 meeting of the Grand Lodge. See Proceedings of the Grand Lodge of Freemasons, Illinois, from its organization in 1840 to 1850, inclusive, Freeport, Illinois, 1892. The anti-Mormons were passing resolutions calling for Joseph's extradition and hoping for some provocation from Nauvoo that would furnish an. But Joseph's worst peril, as he understood perfectly, was ripening within his own kingdom. "My life is more in danger from some little doughhead of a fool in this city than from all my numerous and inveterate enemies abroad," he declared. "I am exposed to far greater danger from traitors among ourselves than from enemies without. I can live as Caesar might have lived were it not for a right-hand Brutus. We have a Judas in our midst." For many months now, Joseph had been watching the progressive alienation of one of his ablest and most courageous men. William Law had been his second counselor for more than 2 years, proving as steadfast and incorruptible as John C. Bennett had been treacherous and dissolute. Law had come from Canada, a wealthy man. He had invested in real estate, construction, and steam mills, fostering more than anyone else the sorely needed industrialization of the city. In the beginning, Law hid his resentment over the prophet's monopoly of the management of real estate in and about the city, though he thought it unseemly in a man of God. He had been particularly shocked when Joseph threatened to excommunicate any wealthy convert who came to Nauvoo and purchased land without his counsel. Finally, he came to mistrust Joseph's business judgment and refused to invest money in the publication of the revised version of the Bible, placing his funds instead in a steam mill and hemp farm. Ibidem, Volume 5, pages 272-3, Volume 6, pages 164-5. The prophet was constantly pleading for money to build the temple and the Nauvoo house, which Law thought might well be delayed until the acute housing shortage in the city was alleviated. The temple was now the chief spectacle on the upper Mississippi, but the workmen who sweated over its great stones were living on parched corn. The Nauvoo house, on the other hand, despite generous donations and liberal purchases of stock, seemed scarcely to be growing at all. Law became convinced, whether rightly or wrongly, that Joseph was using the funds donated for the hotel to buy more land, which he then sold for a generous profit to new converts. Eventually, Law and Robert Foster, who were the chief contractors in the city, began to beat against the autarkic economy that hemmed them in. They purchased part of the lumber floated down the Mississippi from Wisconsin, which had been intended exclusively for church buildings, and began to build houses and stores. Since they paid wages while the prophet paid the workmen on the temple and the Nauvoo house in goods and city scrip, a nasty labor crisis resulted. Joseph called upon the workmen to continue on the church projects and deplored Foster's mammoth skeletons rising all over the town. "There is no flesh on them," he cried. "They are all for personal interest and aggrandizement. I want the Nauvoo house built. It must be built. Our salvation depends upon it. I will say to those who have labored on the Nauvoo house and cannot get their pay, be patient. And if any man takes the means which are set apart for the building of that house and applies it to his own use, let him, for he will destroy himself. If any man is hungry, let him come to me, and I will feed him at my table. I will divide with them to the last morsel. And then if the man is not satisfied, I will kick his backside. Ibidem, Volume 5, pages 285-6. The rift between William Law and the prophet thus began in a fundamental divergence of economic attitudes. The final break in their friendship, however, came from a question, not of finance but of fidelity. With sorrow and suspicion, Law watched Joseph ever enlarging his circle of wives. Then the prophet tried to approach Law's own wife, Jane Dennison L. Harris and Robert Scott, who spied for Joseph at the meetings held by Law and Foster, reported many years later that they had seen 3 veiled women, one of them William Law's wife, come to one meeting and sign affidavits to the effect that Joseph and Hyrum Smith had endeavored to seduce them, had made the most indecent and wicked proposals to them, and wished them to become their wives, as reported to Horace Cummings, who described their accounts in the Contributor, Salt Lake City, April 1884, Volume 5, page 255. Thomas Ford also reported that Joseph attempted to win Jane Law for his wife. See his History of Illinois, page 322, and John D. Lee wrote that Joseph wanted the amiable and handsome wife of William Law, Mormonism Unveiled, page 147. Joseph H. Jackson wrote in 1844 that Joseph told him he spent 2 months vainly trying to win Jane Law, and added that Emma Smith suggested that she be given. Narrative of the Adventures and Experiences of Joseph H. Jackson, pages 21-2. In a violent session with his leader, Law called for a reformation and an end to the debauchery that was corrupting the church. Joseph argued, pleaded, and quoted the Old Testament to no avail. Law threatened that unless Joseph went before the High Council, confessed his sins, and promised repentance, he would expose his seductions before the whole world. I'll be damned before I do, Law later quoted Joseph as saying, if I admitted to the charges you would heap upon me, it would prove the overthrow of the church. Is not that inevitable already? Law demanded. Then we can all go to hell together, and convert it into a heaven by casting the devil out. Hell is by no means the place this world of fools suppose it to be, but on the contrary, it is quite an agreeable place. Outraged by the prophet's banter, Law turned on his heel, saying bitterly, You can enjoy it then, but as for me, I will serve the Lord our God, as described by Law in the Nauvoo Expositor, the 7th of June, 1844. This was the beginning of Law's apostasy, but for some months an open break was avoided. Like so many other disaffected members, Law believed Joseph to be not a false but a fallen prophet, led into iniquity by the teachings of John C. Bennett and his own hot passions. He clung to Joseph's earliest revelations, to the original purity of the gospel message which had made him a convert, and hoped that something would bring the prophet to his senses. The 1843 election had given the saints their first inkling that Law was in disfavor. And when Joseph denounced the Judas in Nauvoo, many of them guessed whom he was accusing. Law was privately told that the destroying angels had orders to put him out of the way, and though Joseph elaborately denied the story before a city council, Law was not wholly reassured. See History of the Church, Volume 6, pages 1-6-2-5. Together with his brother Wilson, he began to gravitate into the camp of other disgruntled Mormons. Here were William Marks, Austin Cowles, and Leonard Sobey, bitterly opposed to polygamy. There was young Francis Higbee, who had never forgiven the prophet for publicly denouncing him as debauched and profligate during the Bennett scandal. Also his brother Chauncey, whose reputation in Nauvoo was little better. Hyrum Kimball was almost ready to join their ranks. Since he owned a good portion of the land along the river and had built many of the steamboat wharves, he expected to collect the wharfage himself. But Joseph insisted that it was a city prerogative, and publicly threatened to blow up the steamboats that did not pay. Ibidem, Volume 6, pages 234-238, Kimball, like Law, was further embittered by jealousy, since Joseph had once coveted his wife Sarah and had tried in 1842 to win her for a spiritual wife. See Sarah Kimball's sworn statement quoted on page 306. Chief among the dissenters was Dr. Robert D. Foster, whose own grievances strikingly paralleled those of Kimball and William Law. For a long time he had resented the prophet's opposition to his business ventures, but still looked to him for guidance in spiritual matters. Then, one day, in the spring of 1844, he arrived home unexpectedly from a business trip to discover the prophet dining with his wife. When Joseph left and Foster demanded to know the purpose of his coming, Mrs. Foster refused to talk. Quick to anger and inordinately jealous, he drew his pistol and threatened to shoot her if she did not divulge everything the prophet had said. Gray and terrified, the woman still was silent. Then, in a melodramatic frenzy, Foster seized a double-barreled pistol, thrust it into her hand, and shouted for her to defend herself. "If you don't tell me, either you or I will shoot." Thereupon she fainted. When she recovered, she confessed that the prophet had been preaching the spiritual wife doctrine and had endeavored to seduce her. Foster told this story to a little knot of disaffected Mormons gathered together in a corner grocery store. The Laws, the Higbees, the ne'er-do-well Joseph H. Jackson, and several others. It was the signal for a complete confession. One by one the men cast off reserve and unburdened their souls. Chauncey Higbee vowed that some of the leading elders had as many as 10 or 12 wives apiece, and described how they recorded the names of all the women they wished to marry in a large book, called the Book of the Law of the Lord, kept at the home of Hyrum Smith. After the names were inscribed, he said, the book was sealed, and the seals were broken in the presence of the unsuspecting women, who were thereby convinced that the doctrine was true, and that they must submit. Jackson, who had sought unsuccessfully for the hand of Hyrum Smith's daughter and had long been plotting revenge, intimated that a conspiracy was brewing that would cost them. 2 of the men who listened to these stories scurried off to the prophet. At once he ordered them to write down everything in complete detail, including Foster's account of the attempted seduction of his wife. And on the 17th of April, he published these sworn testimonies in the Nauvoo Neighbor. See the statements of M.G. Eaton and A.B. Williams' Nauvoo Neighbor, Volume 1, Number 51. These were reprinted in Times and Seasons, Volume 5, May 15, 1844, page 541. He did not deign to deny the stories, letting the shock of publication suffice to convince his people that they were lies. Foster's trial was set for the 20th of April, 1844, but when it was learned that he had marshaled 41 witnesses and intended to turn the trial into an indictment of the prophet, a council met secretly in advance and excommunicated him along with William Wilson and Jane Law. See the Nauvoo Expositor, the 7th of June, 1844. The schism thus created in Nauvoo was small but dangerous. Although they were pariahs within the city, the apostates did not leave. It was not alone their business holdings that kept them there. William Law had courage, tenacity, and a strange although he was surrounded chiefly by men who believed Joseph to be a base impostor, he clung to the hope that he could effect a reformation in the church. To this end, he set up a church of his own, with himself as president, following faithfully the organization of the main body. This in itself would not have been serious, for Joseph had seen rival prophets spring out of the grass at his feet before, and they had come to naught. Usually they tried to imitate him, giving out revelations that sounded stale and flat beside his own, prophesying wildly and organizing badly. But Law was cut to a different pattern. Actually, he was on the road to complete and ugly disillusionment, but he was walking backwards away from the church, looking eagerly for something in the landscape to which he could cling, grasping at every tree and hedgerow. His desperate desire to reform the church made him far more formidable than if he had set out to damn the prophet and all his works. Unlike John C. Bennett, he was willing to glove his mailed fist. And, more important, he and Foster had enough money to buy a printing press. The Reformed Church was to have a mouthpiece 6 weeks after it was born, in a newspaper styled the Nauvoo Expositor. While they were waiting for the press to arrive, the apostates started a 3-pronged attack on Joseph through the courts. Francis Higbee sued him for $5,000 on a charge of slander. William Law succeeded in getting a grand jury in Carthage to issue a bill of indictment against him for adultery and polygamy, and Jackson and Foster got a similar indictment for false swearing. See History of the Church, Volume 6, pages 403-405. Joseph was not afraid of what the laws might swear against him in a Carthage court, for he knew they would be hard-pressed to prove him guilty. For 3 years his clerks had accompanied him everywhere, writing down everything he had said and done. Every day was accounted for, and all references to plural marriage had been so adroitly disguised that only the initiated would understand their true significance. Of this he had made sure. See Joseph's own statement on this point, Ibidem, Volume 6, page 409. Francis Higby's assault on the prophet was countered with a campaign of defamation the like of which Nauvoo had not seen since the expulsion of Bennet. Joseph charged Higby with perjury, seduction, and adultery, giving details that the staid Times and Seasons admitted were too indelicate for the public eye and ear. Brigham Young swore that Higby consorted with prostitutes, from whom he had once contracted a venereal disease. Another witness even identified the source of infection as a French prostitute from Warsaw, and said Bennet had given him medical assistance and the prophet had even tried to heal him by prayer. See testimonies of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and H. Sherwood in Times and Seasons, Volume 5, May 15, 1844, pages 537. Chauncey Higby was attacked with the same violent invective in the Nauvoo Neighbor of May 29, when the editor ransacked the secret files of testimony collected in the Bennet scandal and published the old affidavits of 3 women whom Higby had seduced with the promise of marriage under the spiritual wife code. So the mud flew back and forth. Publication of such documents was the worst sort of defensive strategy, since Joseph could not escape being involved by implication. Those who believed staunchly in his denials of polygamy were bewildered by the prodigious perjury of the apostates, and sensitive Mormons who knew something of the truth about polygamy remembered with pain the injunction of Jesus, "He that is without sin among you, let him cast the first stone." Joseph's excesses had cost him what he needed more than anything else: a few months of peace in Nauvoo unmarred by political or personal scandal. Such a period would have seen the election over and some sort of solution for the westward migration worked out. Polygamy could have been sufficiently hidden to keep the Gentiles quiet and his new converts loyal. Then in Texas or Oregon or some isolated valley in the Rocky Mountains he could have taught his people the truth. But he was blind to his own danger, and in a public sermon on May 26th, pressed his savage attack against the apostates with an irresponsible gasconade. "The Lord has constituted me so curiously that I glory in persecution. If oppression will make a wise man mad, much more a fool. If they want a beardless boy to whip all the world, I will get on the top of a mountain and crow like a rooster. I shall always beat them. When facts are proved, truth and innocence will prevail at last." Come on, ye prosecutors, ye false swearers, all hell boil over. Ye burning mountains, roll down your lava, for I will come out on the top at last. I have more to boast of than any man ever had. I am the only man that has ever been able to keep a whole church together since the days of Adam. I boast that no man ever did such a work as I. How I do love to hear the wolves howl. God knows, then, he concluded, that the charges against me are false. What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives, when I can find only one. I am the same man, and as innocent as I was 14 years ago, and I can prove them all perjurers. History of the Church, Volume 6, pages 408-12. Had John C. Bennet been editor of the Nauvoo Expositor instead of William Law and Sylvester Emmons, it would have been a lurid sheet. But Law was no cheap scandalmonger, and had a profound pity for the plural wives in Nauvoo. He vowed that nothing carnal should creep into the Expositor, and the first issue, which appeared on the 7th of June, 1844, was therefore, considering the facts at the editor's disposal, an extraordinarily restrained document. The chief editorial mentioned no names, but simply described the story of a typical English girl coming alone to Nauvoo and being carefully indoctrinated in the mysteries of the kingdom by the prophet. This was followed by 3 affidavits, signed by William Law, Jane Law, and Austin Cowles, testifying that they had all seen or heard read the revelation granting every man the privilege of marrying 10 virgins, and forgiving him all sins save the shedding of innocent blood. Polygamy was only the first of a long list of practices signaled out for attack. Against Joseph's attempt to unite church and state, and his grasping for political power, the expositor was most eloquent. We do not believe that God ever raised up a prophet to Christianize a world by political schemes and intrigue. It is not the way God captivates the heart of the unbeliever, but on the contrary, by preaching truth in its own nature. End quote. We will not, it said further, in an unmistakable allusion to Joseph's kingship, acknowledge any man as king or lawgiver to the church, for Christ is our only king and lawgiver. The editors struck at Joseph's financial maneuvering and land speculation, at his constant denunciation of Missouri, and at his misuse of the privileges granted by the Nauvoo charters. They called for repeal of the charters, disobedience to political revelations, an end of the abuses of the unit power centered in the prophet, and the strongest censure of his moral imperfections. The expositor spread consternation throughout the city. Those who were practicing polygamy feared a massacre by the anti-Mormons. Those who had been kept in ignorance were overwhelmed by the realization that all the surreptitious gossip might after all be true. See the letters of Sarah and Isaac Scott to their relatives in Massachusetts, dated the 16th of June and the 22nd of July, 1844, published in The Death of a Mormon Dictator. Letters of Massachusetts Mormons, 1843 to 1848, New England Quarterly, Volume 9, 1936, pages 583-617. These waited in mixed anger and dismay for the prophet's answer. When the prophet read the expositor through, he knew that he was facing the gravest crisis of his. The paper had put him on trial before his whole people. Perhaps if Joseph had faced them with the truth, and had gone to the platform in the unfinished temple and read the revelation on plural marriage to his church, with his old magnificent assurance, he might have stripped the apostates of their chief weapon and freed his loyal followers from a burden of secrecy, evasion, and lying that was rapidly becoming intolerable. Had he bared his plans for going west, he could have given them hope and a challenge, but he had no courage for it. In spite of the elaborate metaphysics he had created to justify polygamy, in spite of all the Old Testament prophets who had lived it and the success of his own experimentation, the crisis found him soft-willed. He was empty of conviction when he needed it most. With a kind of desperation, he turned to William Marks, who had so faithfully come to his rescue in past crises with his wisdom and liberal purse, but who in recent months had turned from him in sorrow. They walked down the street together in the bright summer sunlight, turned into a little used lane where they could talk in private, and sat down on the grassy bank. "We are a ruined people," Joseph began. "How so?" Marks asked guardedly, for he had so long kept a troubled silence that he no longer knew how to talk to his leader. "This doctrine of polygamy, or spiritual wife system, that has been taught and practiced among us will prove our destruction and overthrow. I have been deceived. It is a curse to mankind, and we shall have to leave the United States soon, unless it can be put down and its practice stopped in the church." The older man was ready to weep with gratitude. This was what he had been hoping to hear ever since he had seen the cursed revelation on polygamy almost a year before. "Now, Brother Marks," Joseph went on, "you have not received this doctrine, and I want you to go into the High Council, and I will have charges preferred against all who practice this doctrine, and I want you to try them by the laws of the church, and cut them off if they will not repent, and cease the practice of this doctrine, and I will go into the stand and preach against it with all my might. And in this way we will rid the church of this damnable heresy." This interview was described by William Marks in Zion's Harbinger and Bailamy's Organ, Volume 3, July 1853, pages 52-3. His account may be colored somewhat by his profound antipathy to polygamy. But Joseph was only striking blindly for a way out of his dilemma, and the embarrassments of this particular solution must have made him discard it by sundown. He did not know what to do. Only one theme persisted in all his agitation: a conviction that the expositor must be throttled. But here again he was betrayed by his utter incapacity for dealing skillfully with opposition, a weakness that his political and legal successes in Nauvoo had served only to intensify. He had become an autocrat who could think only in terms of suppression. Calling together the city council, he ordered a trial, not of the apostates, but of the expositor itself. It was a strange high-handed proceeding. There were no jury, no lawyers, no witnesses for the defense. The councilors simply stood up, one after another, and accused the editors of seduction, pandering, counterfeiting, and thievery. The prophet went so far as to say that the apostate Joseph H. Jackson had been proved a murderer before the city council. Then he went on to add one more to his list of denials of polygamy by declaring that the revelation on polygamy referred to in the expositor was in answer to a question concerning things which transpired in former days and had no reference to the present time. The Nauvoo Neighbor, the 19th of June, 1844. The words uttered by Joseph that I have italicized were omitted from the History of the Church when the proceedings were reprinted. See Volume 6, page 441. The city council now declared that the press was libelous and must be destroyed. Joseph issued a proclamation declaring it a civic nuisance. A portion of the legion marched to the office, wrecked the press, pied the type, and burned every issue of the hated paper that could be found. The Expositor was neither the first nor the last Illinois paper to be so destroyed. Burning abolitionist presses was something of a sport close to the Mason-Dixon line. But for a leader of a hated minority to indulge in this sport was not frontier license, but a violation of the Holy Constitution. It was a greater breach of political and legal discipline than the anti-Mormons could have hoped for. Joseph could not have done better for his enemies, since he had at last given them a fighting moral issue. The apostates fled to Warsaw and Carthage. Robert Foster wrote for the Warsaw Signal a detailed statement in which he not only described the destruction of the press, but also accused Joseph of a long list of crimes, from the hiring of Porter Rockwell to kill Boggs to the seduction of innumerable Mormon women. History affords no parallel to the iniquities and enormities of this tyrant, he concluded, who, dressed in a little brief authority, perpetrates deeds at which heaven weeps and human nature falls back ashamed of her own depravity. Thomas Sharp's editorial on the 12th of June screamed with demoniac fury. War and extermination is inevitable. Citizens, arise, one and all. Can you stand by and suffer such infernal devils to rob men of their property and rights without avenging them? We have no time for comments. Every man will make his own. Let it be made with powder and balls. Joseph, too late, saw that he had loosed an He wrote a long defensive letter to Governor Ford justifying the destruction of the press on legal grounds, and dispatched orders to the 12 apostles to return home at once with powder, lead, and a rifle, packed discreetly in their luggage. History of the Church, Volume 6, page 487. Then he went to instruct the legion in the defense of the city. Mounting the reviewing stand, his blue and buff uniform blazoned with gilt buttons and epaulets, he stood proudly before his men, betraying nothing of the tumult and anxiety racking him within. He made a dogged defense of the legality of his position. Since the burning of the press, Law and Foster had secured warrants for his arrest on the charge of riot, which with his usual dexterity he had evaded through the habeas corpus procedure of the Nauvoo Municipal Court. But this, he knew, was little more than a postponement. Hourly scouts were bringing him word of the angry crowds that were swarming the streets of Carthage and Warsaw. Missourians and Iowans were crossing the river in droves, attracted like flies to the smell of blood. Armed bands already were threatening isolated Mormon families and driving them into. There was lynch talk everywhere. Always in the name of justice and liberty, Joseph read to his men the inflammatory editorial of the Warsaw Signal Extra so that they should be under no illusions about what faced them. Then he said, "We are American citizens. We live upon a soil for the liberties of which our fathers periled their lives and spilt their blood upon the battlefield. Those rights, so dearly purchased, shall not be disgracefully trodden under foot by lawless marauders without at least a noble effort on our part to sustain our liberties. Will you stand by me to the death?" The thousands arrayed beneath him, stiff and serious in their well-ordered ranks, shouted in unison a thunderous "Aye! If you had not done it, I would have gone out there," and he swept his arm to the west, and would have raised up a mightier people. Then, drawing his sword from the scabbard, Joseph thrust it heavenward, and shouted in a voice that carried over the ranks of the army and down the city streets, "I call God and angels to witness that I have unsheathed my sword with a firm and unalterable determination that this people shall have their legal rights and be protected from mob violence, or my blood shall be spilt upon the ground like water, and my body consigned to the silent tomb." Chapter 27. Carthage. Once more the Mormon women braced themselves for the shock of an uprooting. They were used to it by now, some having made all 5 migrations and accepted what threatened to be expulsion from Nauvoo almost with resignation. Satan would give the children of God no rest. Was there something intrinsically alien in Mormonism that continually invited barbarity even in the land of the free? It could not have been the theology, which, however challenging, was really a potpourri of American religious thinking spiced with the fundamental ideal of inevitable progress. Nor could it have been the economy, which had shifted from communism to free enterprise and then to autarky. Wherever the Mormons went, the citizens resented their self-righteousness, their unwillingness to mingle with the world, their intense consciousness of superior destiny. But these were negligible factors in creating the ferocious antagonisms of Missouri and Illinois. Actually, each migration had risen out of a special set of circumstances. The move to Kirtland from New York had been opportunistic. The flight from Kirtland had been largely the result of apostate rather than non-Mormon persecution. The various Missouri expulsions had been rooted deep in the slavery and Indian issues, which did not figure at all in Illinois. In the latter state, to a far greater extent than in Missouri, the political exploitation of Mormon numbers, made doubly repugnant by the presence of immigrant converts from monarchist England, was perhaps the most volatile fuel feeding the anti-Mormon fire. Those who lived closest to the Mormon mass were desperately afraid of being crushed. They hated Joseph Smith because thousands followed him blindly and slavishly. To them, the Nauvoo theocracy was a malignant tyranny that was spreading as swiftly and dangerously as a Mississippi flood, and that might eventually engulf the very government of the United States. Thomas Sharp had once published in the Warsaw Signal a wholly imaginary story of a massacre of 500 anti-Mormons by 10,000 Mormon legionaries. The account ended with the enraged citizens of 3 states marching upon Nauvoo, sacking and burning the city, and killing all the inhabitants. This was more than vicious propaganda. It was prophecy of what Sharp expected in the future. Anti-Mormonism in Illinois was much more dangerous than it had been in Missouri because it had a rock-bound moral foundation in the American fear of despotism. This, and not repugnance for polygamy, which, unlike the glorification of theocracy, was not yet preached openly, was the primary source of the venom in the now swiftly mobilizing opposition. The prophet sensed something of the magnitude of the forces rising against him, and probably felt also its spiritual strength. As his old buoyancy and optimism deserted him, the once occasional intuition of imminent death became a constant, chilling presence. He began seriously to think about the problem of a successor, and urged Hiram to safety in Ohio, so that if the worst befell him, there might be a leader to avenge his death. Until now, the question of a successor had never seriously troubled him. He had taken it for granted that his mantle would descend, in true dynastic fashion, upon his eldest son, Joseph, now a bright, eager 12-year-old and a favorite in the church. Shortly after he had escaped to Nauvoo from Liberty Jail, Joseph had blessed the boy and promised him the succession. But few of the saints had knowledge of the incident. In the winter of 1843, however, during a sermon to his people in the Grove, he had called his son to the stand beside him and said with emphasis, "I have often been asked who would succeed me as the prophet to the church. My son Joseph will be your next prophet." The Utah Mormons deny that Joseph's son was appointed his father's heir. and hold that the right of succession lay with the apostles, but the evidence that Joseph Smith intended young Joseph to be his successor is impressive. See the sworn statements of Sophia K. Cook, niece of Martin Harris, James Whitehead, secretary to Joseph Smith, and John H. Carter, all of whom heard this speech, Zion's Ensign, Volume 12, Number 29, page 5, and Temple Lot Case, pages 28-180. Lyman White said in a letter to the Northern Islander, "Editor, if you had been present when Joseph called on me shortly after we came out of jail to lay hands with him on the head of a youth, and heard him cry aloud, 'You are my successor when I depart,' and heard the blessings poured on his head, you would not have been led by blind fanaticism." Reprinted in Saints Advocate, Volume 7, September 1884, page 478. Joseph's son swore in later years that he remembered this incident, and added, "I was also present at a meeting in the grove near the temple, and I remember my father laying his hands on my head and saying to the people that this was his successor, or was to be his successor." Temple Lot Case, page 79. Henry Brown, in his History of Illinois, New York, 1844, stated, "The prophet, it is said, has left a will or revelation appointing a successor, and, among other things, it is stated that his son, a lad of 12 years, is named therein as his successor. Of this, however, there is no certainty." See page 489. John D. Lee wrote in his Confessions, "It was then understood among the saints that young Joseph was to succeed his father." Mormonism Unveiled, page 155. At that time, trouble had seemed very remote. But now Joseph feared that an assassin would cut short his days before he saw the age of 40. On the 4th of April, 1844, when he met with the apostles in one of their last meetings before they left on a campaign tour, he rushed through instructions which Orson Hyde described as every ordinance of the holy priesthood. Then he said, "Now, if they kill me, you have got all the keys and all the ordinances, and you can confer them upon others, and the hosts of Satan will not be able to tear down the kingdom as fast as you will be able to build it up." Times and Seasons, Volume 5, the 15th of September, 1844, page 651. After Joseph's death, Brigham Young, who was president of the apostles, looked back to this meeting and concluded that the prophet had placed the authority of the church and all rights of succession directly in his hands. When Thomas Ford learned of the burning of the expositor, he went directly to Carthage for an investigation, determined to call out the militia if necessary to bring the offenders to justice. He was appalled to discover the militia already assembling under the orders of the local constables and openly preparing for an attack on Nauvoo. After an interview with the Laws, Fosters, and Higbees, who, it may be assumed, told him the worst, Ford wrote to the prophet, demanding that he and everyone else implicated in the destruction of the expositor submit immediately to the Carthage constable and come to that city for trial. This, in fact, Joseph had already offered to do, provided that he was allowed a military escort of his own men to prevent a lynching. But Ford, though admitting that the militia was already almost beyond legal control, feared a civil war should the Nauvoo Legion march to Carthage, and denied him this privilege. "If you," he concluded, "by refusing to submit, shall make it necessary to call out the militia, I have great fears that your city will be destroyed, and your people, many of them, exterminated. You know the excitement of the public mind. Do not tempt it too far." When Joseph, who was hiding in the secret attic room of the mansion house, read this letter through, he shook his head in despair. "There is no mercy here." "No," agreed Hiram. "Just as sure as we fall into their hands, we are dead men." They talked for a while about going to Washington and laying the case before President Tyler. But knowing his unpopularity and certain defeat in the coming election, this seemed futile. "If Hiram and I are ever taken again," Joseph said with conviction, "we shall be massacred, or I am not a prophet of God. I want Hiram to live to avenge my blood, but he is determined not to leave me." This whole conversation was later reported by Abraham C. Hodge, who was present. History of the Church, Volume 6, pages 545-6. The two brothers stared at each other wordlessly for a time, while their friends stood by dumb, miserable, and helpless to aid them. Then, his face brightening, Joseph made his decision with his old swiftness and certainty. "The way is open. It is clear to my mind what to do. All they want is Hiram and myself. Then tell everybody to go about their business, and not to collect in groups, but to scatter about. There is no doubt they will come here and search for us. Let them search. They will not harm you in person or property, and not even a hair of your head. We will cross the river tonight, and go away to the west." Within a few hours their plans were complete. The Maid of Iowa was to sail up the Ohio River carrying their families east to safety, and the two brothers, with the doughty Rockwell and the devoted Willard Richards, were to cross the Mississippi in a skiff. At midnight the men bade farewell to their weeping families and started across the river in a blinding rain. Joseph could not shake off a sense of ill omen. The Mississippi, which had been such a friendly barrier between him and Missouri, was now in flood. Weeks of rain to the north had swelled it into a hideous, menacing evil. For many miles above and below Nauvoo, the lowland farms were inundated. Newly built cabins, half buried in mud or torn loose altogether and churned into a jumble of rivermen swore it was the worst flood they had seen in a lifetime of fighting the upper Mississippi. Porter Rockwell, whose shoulders were as tireless as an engine, took the oars. Struck again and again by snags that could not be seen in the blackness, the skiff sprang leaks, and the men were forced to strip off their boots and bail the water out to keep from sinking. It took them until dawn to fight their way across, but the river was only one factor in Joseph's gloom. He was landing in Iowa, where there was still a price on his head. The governor of the Iowa Territory had never agreed not to extradite him to Missouri on the old charge of treason. Moreover, Joseph had neither equipment nor appetite for the lonely and savage western trail, and he could not stifle a sense of guilt at deserting his people. In Missouri he had been their champion, and by his own dramatic surrender had ransomed them from annihilation. But where now was the miraculous confidence that had borne him through that ordeal? Emma had been weeping silently when he bade her goodbye, but her great hazel eyes, the only remnant of her once haunting beauty, had been full of reproach. He knew that she thought him a coward. When they landed and dried their drenched clothing before the fireplace of a trusted saint, Joseph dictated a short note to Emma which reflected his pessimism and indecision. "Do not despair. If God ever opens a door that is possible for me, I will see you again. I do not know where I shall go, or what I shall do, but shall, if possible, endeavor to get to the city of Washington. May God Almighty bless you and the children and mother. My heart bleeds, no more at present. If you conclude to go to Kirtland, Cincinnati, or any other place, I wish you would contrive to inform me this evening." The original of this letter is in the library of the Reorganized Church in Independence, Missouri. Rockwell rode back with the message, bearing orders to get Joseph's best horses across the river. In Nauvoo he learned that a posse had arrived to arrest the prophet, and, discovering him gone, had galloped madly back to Carthage with the news. The Mormon women were wild with apprehension. The legion was divided between those who wanted to defend the city and those who felt, like Joseph, that the safety of everyone could best be secured by their scattering. With Joseph and Hiram gone, with the apostles away and Rigdon in Pittsburgh, the city found itself completely leaderless. It is said that Emma took Rockwell aside and insisted that he go back to Joseph and entreat him to return. She gave him a letter bearing her own plea, and saw to it that he was accompanied by Reynolds Cahoon, who was certain that unless Joseph gave himself up, Nauvoo would be ravaged. Joseph listened in silence to Cahoon, who had brought not only the opinions of the worst alarmists in the city, but also fresh assurances from Governor Ford that the prophet would be guaranteed complete protection and a fair and legal trial. "When the shepherd deserts his flock," Cahoon finished, "who is to keep the wolves from devouring them?" All of the blithe optimism and exuberance out of which so many revelations had sprung in the past when Joseph had been confronted with a crisis had now fled. "If my life is of no value to my friends," he said dully, "it is of none to myself." Turning to Porter Rockwell, he asked, "What shall I do?" The faithful Rockwell was made to obey orders and dared not influence his leader in so hazardous a decision. You are oldest and ought to know best, and as you make your bed I will lie with you. Joseph now turned to his brother. You are the oldest, Hiram. What shall we do? Hiram, who had none of Joseph's prescience, and had always believed his brother invincible, replied, Let us go back and give ourselves up, and see the thing out. For a long time Joseph stared fixedly into the fire at his feet. Then he raised his head and spoke with a great weariness. If you go back, I will go with you, but we shall be butchered. No, no, Hiram cried with a stubborn optimism. Let us go back and put our trust in God, and we shall not be harmed. The Lord is in it. If we live or have to die, we will be reconciled to our fate. This conversation, and all the details that follow, except where noted, are taken from the first-hand testimonies of men who accompanied the prophet until his death. They were compiled and published in History of the Church, Volume 6, pages 547 to 631, Volume 7, pages 1 to 164. From this moment forward, if the observations of the men closest to him in these hours can be relied upon, Joseph moved and spoke like a man certain he is about to die. Tender and melancholy with his friends, and filled with a consuming hunger to see familiar faces and familiar objects once more, he climbed into the boat and looked eagerly across the expanse of. As the boat drew close to the green hills checkered with red brick houses, the great temple, complete now except for the roof and steeple, gleaming white and ethereal in the afternoon sun, he said, half to himself, I should like to speak to the saints once more. We can send out word and have them hear you by starlight, Rockwell suggested. But under the urgency of preparations for the defense in Carthage, this plan was abandoned. Although perhaps inwardly certain of his fate, Joseph was by no means resigned to it, and spent most of his precious hours securing lawyers and witnesses and mapping out his case. A stranger in the mansion house, who talked with him at this time, wrote later that he was easy and seemed sure of an acquittal if he could get a fair hearing. Trapped. An account by B.W. Richmond, published in the Chicago Times, and reprinted in the Deseret News, the 27th of November, 1875. Ford had ordered the disbanding of the Legion and the surrender of all the arms belonging to the state, which consisted of several hundred stands of rifle. To this Joseph now agreed, despite the protests of the Legion officers, who feared a repetition of the sacking of Far West. But, to make sure this time that his men would not be disarmed completely, Joseph ordered that all personal arms should be secretly stored in a convenient warehouse, where they would be available at a moment's notice. Diary of Oliver B. Huntington, who went with his father to stack and hide them before dawn on the day following Joseph's departure for Carthage. See Volume 1, page 45. At midday on the 24th of June, 1844, Joseph Street hearted for Carthage with his brother Hiram and the handful of men who were to stand trial with them. First he rode past the temple, staring affectionately up at its high white facade. Then his eyes swept slowly down over the neat square blocks and rows of new houses, flanked by gardens and green young orchards leading down to the swelling river. This is the loveliest place and the best people under the heavens, he cried. Little do they know the trials that await them. Near the edge of the city, they met a company of saints who had marched in from Ramus to join the Legion. The men were exhausted by the all-night march. Some, whose shoes were thin, had worn through the soles, and their feet were cut and bleeding. Joseph's young cousin, John Lyman Smith, ran up and flung his arms about him. When Joseph saw the boy's feet, he began to weep. God bless you. God bless you, my dear boy. Turning to a shoemaker who stood nearby in the door of his shop, he called out, Let these men have some shoes. The man shrugged helplessly. I have no shoes. The reply angered Joseph. Let them have boots, then. Turning to his cousin, he said, Johnny, the troops will be disbanded and return home. I shall go to Carthage for trial, under the protection of the governor. Have no fears, for you shall yet see Israel triumph and in peace. A transcript of this manuscript account by John Lyman Smith may be seen in the Utah State Historical Society Library. Joseph and Hiram were escorted into Carthage by a well-disciplined company of militia from McDonough County, who met them en route. but once they arrived in the center of the town, they were surrounded by the troops from Warsaw and Carthage, who met them with shouts of derision and triumph. "Stand away, you Macdonough boys, and let us shoot the damned Mormons. God damn you, old Joe, we've got you now. Clear the way, and let us see old Joe, the prophet of God. He's seen the last of Nauvoo. We'll use him up and kill all the damned Mormons." It was so like the capitulation in Far West that Joseph must have felt that he was living his life over. There was a great difference, however, in the two crises. The methods of Lowburn Boggs and Thomas Ford were exactly opposite. Ford, though fearing and disliking the Mormons and believing Joseph Smith to be a consummate charlatan, was determined on a legal trial. But, paradoxically, it was this very passion for justice that was to be Joseph's greatest danger. Boggs's very bloodthirstiness had been a boon, because Gentile champions rose up to fight it and save the prophet's life. But in Illinois, Ford was his only champion, and Ford was weak. He had had the misfortune to inherit a multitude of evils from Thomas Carlin, one of Illinois' worst governors. The state was burdened by a $14 million debt foolishly incurred for canals and railroads. The currency of the state was practically worth less, and the people were either unwilling or unable to pay taxes. All these troubles were dwarfed now by the magnitude of the Mormon problem, which was threatening to precipitate a civil war at the very moment when the worst Mississippi flood in the state's history was piling up damage of from $12 to $20 million. To meet these crises, Ford brought a discriminating and sensitive intelligence and a stubborn loyalty for the law. But he was a poor orator, lacking in the support of his own party and sensitive to the constant accusation that he was pro-Mormon. He appeared, wrote B.W. Richmond, like a man weary of human nature and of life. In his heart, as Ford confessed later, he hoped that Joseph Smith would escape from jail and leave the state. Knowing that his followers would trail him anywhere, he believed it would be the least costly method of ridding the state of the whole sect. But he took no steps to make this possible. At the preliminary hearing in Carthage on the charge of riot, all the cases were deferred and the men released on bail. Only Joseph and Hyrum were kept in custody. Special writs had been sworn out against them on a charge of treason, the excuse being that they had declared martial law and had called out the Legion on the 19th of June when the posse first appeared to arrest Joseph. Ford himself admitted that this charge was extremely flimsy. Although there had been no preliminary hearing on the treason charge, the two brothers were unceremoniously clapped into jail. Ford was aware of the high-handed procedure of the Carthage Justice of the Peace, but justified his own inaction on constitutional grounds. Actually, he was afraid of the militia and was willing to make minor concessions to keep it in at least a nominal state of discipline. Carthage jail was a stout, two-story stone building with a spacious cell on the upper floor. Joseph was permitted the use of several rooms, and his friends had easy access to his presence. They kept him informed of all the rumors of conspiracy against him that were circulating throughout the town. Ford himself came to the jail and talked with the prophet for several hours. They were both young men, Ford 44 and Joseph not yet 39. But Ford's slight figure, sharp face, and thin voice contrasted strangely with Joseph's size and booming eloquence. They argued back and forth, testing each other's sincerity and strength, and came to agreement, according to the carefully detailed reports of the prophet's companions, John Taylor and J.M. Bernhizzle, on almost everything save the wrecking of the expositor. The press in the United States is looked upon as the great bulwark of American freedom, Ford insisted, and its destruction in Nauvoo was represented and looked upon as a high-handed measure, and manifest to the people a disposition on your part to suppress the liberty of speech and of the press. Could we suffer a set of worthless vagabonds to come into our city, Joseph replied hotly, and right under our own eyes and protection vilify and calumniate not only ourselves, but the character of our wives and daughters, as was impudently and unblushingly done in that infamous and filthy sheet? There is not a city in the United States that would have suffered such an indignity for 24 hours. There may have been some better way, but I confess I could not see it. When Ford remarked that he was going to Nauvoo to address the Mormons, Joseph begged to be taken along, for he was certain that the governor's presence was the only thing keeping the militia under control. Ford promised to do so. That night Joseph lay on a mattress on the floor between two of his friends. He could not sleep, and talked in low tones to the two men beside him, who tried vainly to rally his spirits. "I would like to see my family again," he said wistfully, and then added, "I wish to God that I could preach to the saints in Nauvoo once more." When everyone was asleep save Dan Jones, the man on his left, Joseph whispered to him, "Are you afraid to die? Has that time come, you think?" Jones asked, and then after a moment's reflection he said with quiet courage, "Engaged in such a cause, I do not think that death would have many terrors." Joseph was deeply moved. "You will yet see Wales," he said, "and fulfill the mission appointed you before you die." When finally he fell asleep, Joseph dreamed that he was back in Kirtland, standing on the farm that for 6 years had been his pride. Weeds and brambles clogged the footpaths. The barn was falling into decay, its doors ripped off and the weatherboarding gone. Everywhere were signs of neglect and vandalism. Then out of the barn rushed a band of furious men, railing at him for trespassing. This he denied, claiming the farm as a gift from the church and insisting that it had never been sold. The band swelled into a rabble. The men drew their knives and rushed at him, cursing. Then somehow, in the irrational fashion of dreams, the men began to fight among themselves, and Joseph slipped away. But the mud outside the barn, ankle-deep, clung to his feet like the heavy chains of the Richmond jail. He fought against it, sweating and terrified, and then awoke. In the morning he told this dream to Dan Jones, who then went out to gather information. As Jones left, the guard whispered to him, "We had too much trouble to bring old Joe here to let him ever escape alive, and unless you want to die with him, you had better leave before sundown. And you are not a damned bit better for taking his part, and you'll see that I can prophesy better than old Joe, for neither he nor his brother nor anyone who will remain with them will see the sun set today." Jones went at once to find the governor. As he passed the square, he heard a stump speaker from Warsaw haranguing a crowd and pressed close to catch his words. "Our troops will be discharged this morning in obedience to orders, and for a sham we will leave the town. But when the governor and the MacDonough troops have left for Nauvoo this afternoon, we will return and kill those men, if we have to tear the jail down." Shouting and cheering, the men lifted their rifles high and shook them in a fierce gesture of unity. When Jones related to the governor everything he had heard, Ford merely shook his head in annoyance. "You are unnecessarily alarmed for the safety of your friends, sir. The people are not that cruel." Ford had in fact decided to go to Nauvoo without the prophet, believing that the militia would not dare commit any violence to the prisoners, so long as he himself was within easy reach of Mormon vengeance. He ordered all the troops disbanded save 3 companies, 1 to accompany him to Nauvoo, the remaining 2 to guard the jail. The company from Warsaw, most frenzied of all, were told to go home, but the Carthage Greys, who were only slightly less incendiary, were detailed to remain in the town overnight. When Jones returned to the jail to bring this alarming news to the prophet, he was denied admittance. Joseph was in the upper room, calmly dictating a letter. Carthage Jail, the 27th of June, 1844, 20 past 8 a.m. Dear Emma, the governor continues his courtesies and permits us to see our friends. We hear this morning that the governor will not go down with his troops today to Nauvoo, as was anticipated last evening. But if he does come down with his troops, you will be protected, and I want you to tell Brother Dunham to instruct the people to stay at home and attend to their own business, and let there be no groups or gathering together unless by permission of the governor. There is no danger of any exterminating order. Should there be a meeting among the troops which we do not anticipate, excitement is abating. A part will remain loyal and stand for the defense of the state and our rights. There is one principle which is eternal. It is the duty of all men to protect their lives and the lives of their households whenever necessity requires, and no power has a right to forbid it. Should the last extreme arrive, but I anticipate no such extreme. But caution is the parent of safety. Joseph Smith, P.S. Dear Emma, I am very much resigned to my lot, knowing I am justified and have done the best that could be done. Give my love to the children and all my friends, Mr. Brower, and all who inquire after me, and as for treason, I know that I have not committed any, and they cannot prove one appearance of anything of the kind. So you need not have any fears that harm can happen to us on that score. May God bless you all. Amen. At this point, Willard Richards, who was now the only one permitted to pass in and out of the jail, brought word to Joseph that Ford had broken his promise and was off to Nauvoo without him. The prophet realized that he was trapped almost beyond hope. There was only one lean trump left in his hand, which he now feared he had waited too long to play. Hastily he scribbled an order to Jonathan Dunham to bring the legion, break the jail, and save him at all costs. Within seconds, 2 messengers bearing this order and the letter to Emma were off at a frantic gallop on the 15-mile trip to Nauvoo. One by one, the friends who had been visiting Joseph and Hiram were forced out of Carthage at bayonet point. Only Willard Richards and John Taylor remained in the jail. About 5 o'clock, when the jailer suggested that they might be safer in the cell, Joseph turned to his pink-cheeked, serious clerk. "If we go into the cell, will you go with us?" "Brother Joseph," Richards replied, "you did not ask me to cross the river with you. You did not ask me to come to Carthage. You did not ask me to come to jail with you. And do you think I would forsake you now? But I will tell you what I will do. If you are condemned to be hung for treason, I will be hung in your stead, and you shall go free." Joseph smiled at him tenderly. "You cannot." "I will," he insisted, and they all knew that he spoke in deadly earnest. Dull and heavy-spirited, the prisoners finally sent for some wine, and all except Hiram sipped a little. According to John Taylor's account, History of the Church, Volume 7, page 101, when Richards handed the bottle to the guard, he started down the stairs. At that moment, there was a noise at the outer door, followed by shouts to surrender and the sound of shots. It was not the Nauvoo Legion galloping up for a dramatic rescue. For some reason never divulged, Jonathan Dunham had pocketed the order and neglected to act upon it, and no other man in Nauvoo knew of his prophet's peril. This story is told by Alan J. Stout in his manuscript journal 1815-89, a transcript of which may be seen in the Utah State Historical Society Library. See page 13. It is confirmed by T.B.H. Stenhouse in his Rocky Mountain Saints, New York, 1873, page 164, and it was the men of the Warsaw militia who had marched out of the town as a token to the governor, waited until he was well on his way to Nauvoo, and then come roaring back to join the Carthage Greys. Joseph had a 6-shooter, and Hiram a single-barrel pistol, which had been smuggled in by friends the previous day. The other 2 men had nothing to defend themselves with save 2 hickory canes. All 4 sprang against the door, but retreated when the first ball penetrated the thick panel. As the door was forced open, 3 of the prisoners jumped nimbly to the left, but Hiram was caught by fire from one of the half-dozen muzzles pointing evilly toward the doorway. The first ball struck him in the nose, and he stumbled backward, crying, "I am a dead man!" As he was falling, 3 more caught him from the door, and a 4th ball from the window shattered his left side. Joseph now discharged all 6 barrels down the passageway. 3 of them missed fire, but the other 3 found marks. One of the wounded rushed back down the stairs, his arm a mass of blood and mangled flesh. "Are you badly hurt?" someone shouted. "Yes, my arm is all shot to pieces by old Joe," he screamed. "But I don't care. I've got revenge. I shot Hiram." A shower of balls was now pouring into the room. John Taylor was hit 5 times, but the only bullet that might have killed him struck his watch, which was in his vest pocket, and was deflected harmlessly away. Willard Richards, who was as big a man as Joseph, miraculously escaped being hit at all, save for a ball that slightly grazed his throat and earlobe, although he stood close to the door beating vainly at the guns with his cane. Most of the balls coming in through the window were striking harmlessly against the ceiling, while the men in the hallway who had not been hit or frightened back by Joseph's shooting were trying to fix their aim upon him. When his pistol was empty, Joseph flung it on the floor, crying, "There! Defend yourselves as well as you can," and sprang to the window. He looked out upon 100 bayonets, gleaming dully in the murky light that seeped through the heavy storm clouds. Behind every bayonet there was a hideously painted face, and it must have seemed to him as if hell itself had vomited up this apparition. It is said by some who saw him that he gave the Masonic signal of distress and cried out, quote, "Is there no help for the widow's son?" Zena Huntington Jacobs, one of Joseph's wives, said in later years in a public address, "I am the widow of a master mason who, when leaping from the window of Carthage jail, pierced with bullets, made the Masonic sign of distress," says Latter-day Saints Biographical Encyclopedia, Volume 1, page 698. Then a ball from the door caught him in the back, and he pitched slowly forward out of the window, his hand still gripping the sill from which he had been preparing to jump. For an instant he hung to the sill swinging, while Levy Williams, the colonel commanding the Warsaw militia, shouted, "Shoot him! God damn him! Shoot the damn it rascal!" But no one shot. William Daniels, see his correct account of the murder of generations Joseph and Hyrum Smith, published by John Taylor in Nauvoo in 1845. Daniels was so troubled at having been a witness to the lynching, if not a participant, that he became a convert. The Mormons later dropped him from fellowship. Who was standing petrified at the sight, heard him cry, "O Lord my God," and watched him drop to the ground. He twisted as he fell, landing on his right shoulder and back, and then rolled over on his face. One of the militia, barefooted and bareheaded, grinning through his black paint, leaped forward and dragged him against the well curb in the yard. The prophet stirred a little and opened his eyes. There was no terror in them, but whether the calmness was from resignation or unconsciousness, one cannot know. Colonel Williams now ordered 4 men to fire at him. As the balls struck, he cringed a little and fell forward on his face. The militia began to scatter and pant, but the same man who had dragged him to the well curb now raised his bowie knife and rushed forward to cut off the prophet's head. At that moment the storm clouds parted, and the setting June sun blazed full upon the scene. To William Daniels it seemed that a pillar of light thrust down from heaven and rested between the dead prophet and his murderers. The arm of the ruffian that held the knife fell powerless, he said. The muskets of the 4 who fired fell to the ground, and they all stood like marble statues, not having power to move a single limb of their bodies. By this time most of the men had fled in great disorder. I never saw so frightened a set of men before. The body of the prophet lay for a time quite alone, until Willard Richards ventured forth to carry it back into the jail and lay it beside the body of his brother. Securing a messenger, he sent word of the murder to Ford, and a message to his own people to do nothing by way of vengeance. Only then did he give in to his shock and inner pain. Epilogue. The murder of Joseph and Hyrum Smith robbed the anti-Mormons of their stomach for civil war. The worst among them had hoped that the Nauvoo Legion, upon hearing of the death of their leaders, would This would have given them an excuse to descend upon Nauvoo, slaughter the inhabitants, and plunder the city. Ford's death they would have counted a gain for the state in any case, but now they fled precipitately, along with their women and children, leaving Carthage forlorn and silent with its dead. When word of the tragedy reached Nauvoo, the city was gripped in a paralysis of horror and loss. "I felt as though I could not live," Alan Stout wrote in his journal. "I knew not how to contain myself, and I hope to live to avenge their blood. But if I do not, I will teach my children to never cease to try to avenge their blood, and then teach their children and children's children to the 4th generation, as long as there was one descendant of the murderers upon the earth." Such passion was never translated into action, for the Mormons were a minority. The Legion followed the injunction of Willard Richards, permitted Ford to remain unmolested, and kept a rigid discipline in the city. The bodies of the martyrs, as they were thereafter always called, were brought to Nauvoo in 2 wooden boxes covered with an Indian horse blanket and prairie grass. When the wagon arrived in the city, the Nauvoo Legion formed a procession behind it, and 10,000 weeping citizens followed them to the mansion house. When Emma was finally permitted to see her husband's body, she flung herself across it and cried in anguish, "Oh, Joseph, Joseph, they have killed you at last." B.W. Richmond, a stranger and guest in the mansion house who was watching the scene, noted a woman standing at Joseph Smith's head, her face covered and her whole frame convulsed with weeping. She was the widow of William Morgan, of Masonic memory, he wrote. The other wives mourned the prophet less openly, but no less bitterly, and it is said that all of Great before the bodies of Joseph and Hyrum were interred, 20,000 saints filed silently past the velvet-covered coffins in a last gesture of homage. Throngs filled the cemetery to watch the pine boxes lowered into the melancholy graves, boxes from which the bodies had been secretly removed and replaced with bags of sand. Fearing desecration of the graves, 10 men buried the corpses at midnight in the basement of the Nauvoo house, and heaped broken stone and rubbish over the spot. Even in death the prophet was permitted no rest. Months later, at Emma's request, the bodies were exhumed and reburied under the summer cottage, where, despite all legend to the contrary, they remain to this day. 5 months after the murder, Joseph's youngest son, David Hyrum, was born. The New York Herald published an extra to announce the death of the prophet, the editor writing in a harsh obituary, "The death of the modern Muhammad will seal the fate of Mormonism. They cannot get another Joe Smith. The holy city must tumble into ruins, and the latter-day saints have indeed come to the latter day." But after 2 days' reflection, James Gordon Bennett amended this judgment, writing on the 10th of July, "Instead of sealing the fate of Mormonism, we are now rather inclined to believe that this revolting transaction may give only a Joe and his brother will be regarded as martyrs to their faith, and but little knowledge of human nature and the history of the past is necessary to inform us of the fact that violence, oppression, and bloodshed strengthen instead of subduing fanaticism. The belated judgment was the truer one. The martyrdom gave to the story of Joseph Smith the imperishable force of tragedy. What was already a legend, it converted into an epic. The martyrdom was a dramatic symbol that God had placed his seal upon the testimony of his prophet, and it was the legend of Joseph Smith, from which all evidences of deception, ambition, and financial and marital excesses were gradually obliterated, that became the great cohesive force within the church. For a time after Joseph's death, it seemed that schisms would disintegrate the church. Sidney Rigdon, after a bitter battle with Brigham Young, retired to Pittsburgh. Lyman White went to Texas, and Charles Thompson to St. Louis. James Jesse Strang set himself up as a king on Beaver Island, Michigan, and William Smith, claiming the succession for himself until his nephew young Joseph should come of age, stayed in Nauvoo until expelled by Brigham Young. All of these lesser prophets followed Joseph's lead in proclaiming visions or giving forth revelations, and most of them practiced polygamy. Only Brigham Young had the sagacity to claim his authority as president of the apostles rather than as an opportunistic revelator. And it was he to whom the bulk of the Mormons turned. When the anti-Mormons saw that Joseph's death had not destroyed the church, they began to hound it in earnest. They faithfully emulated the burning and pillaging of the Missourians, until Brigham Young agreed to take his people west. The heroic epic of the trek to the Great Basin has been told over and over again, occasionally with the fidelity and the magnificence it deserves. To say that Joseph's death enriched the church with the inspiration of a martyr's legend is not to say, however, that his murder was necessary for the survival of the Mormon movement. Historians have commonly held that his empire was crumbling from within, and that only the genius of Brigham Young saved it from ruin. But there is no reason to believe that Joseph could not have survived the defection of William Law, as he had that of the Book of Mormon Witnesses and John C. Bennett. His own story would have lacked the moral grandeur that his death imparted to it. But this was only one factor in the circle. Had Joseph fled west, his saints would have trailed after him, as they had followed him from Kirtland to Missouri in 1838. Open admission of polygamy would have cost him some converts, but no more than it did Brigham Young 8 years later. There would probably have been less order and more suffering in the migration, and it is doubtful if Joseph would have stopped in the barren wastes of the Great Basin, for California would have been more to his taste. His empire might have been far less stable than Brigham Young's, but what it lacked in stability, Joseph would have compensated for in color. Emma did not follow Brigham Young west, but she would have followed her husband. The Gentiles then would not have been able to point to her second marriage to an unbeliever, the attractive Major Louis Bidamon, as proof that in her heart she had scorned Joseph's mission from the beginning. There is no evidence, however, that Emma scorned anything but Brigham Young, whom after Joseph's death she came to fear and despise. She clung to certain relics of her husband's memory, such as his manuscript translation of the Bible, with a superstitious reverence. "I have often thought," she wrote to her son when he took the pages away for printing, "the reason why our house did not burn down, when it has been so often on fire, was because of them, and I still feel a sacredness attached to them." Polygamy, however, she always denied. "There is no revelation on either polygamy or spiritual wives," she said stubbornly. "He had no other wife but me. He did not have improper relations with any woman that ever came to my knowledge." And this was her revenge and solace for all her heartache and humiliation. This was her slap at all the sly young girls in the mansion house who had looked first so worshipfully and then so knowingly at Joseph. She had given them the lie. Whatever formal ceremony he might have gone through, Joseph had never acknowledged one of them before the world. This was her great triumph, and she made the most of it. Her 4 sons clung grimly to their mother's word, despite the sworn testimony of women whom Joseph had loved, and of the guards who had shadowed him when he paid nocturnal. Young Joseph, too, had a score to settle with Brigham Young. Around the youth collected a little knot of disaffected, unhappy men who had tried first one and then another of the welter of sects that sprang up at Joseph's death. The legend grew among this faction that polygamy had been a monstrous fraud, conceived by John Bennett and developed by Brigham Young and perhaps Hyrum Smith, without Joseph's knowledge or consent. Eventually, after trying his hand at storekeeping, railroading, farming, and law, young Joseph took over the leadership of what was called with more exactness than poetry the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. After a time, he gave forth several revelations on church government and social behavior, modest revelations lacking all the majesty and sweep of his fathers. Eventually, this church went back to independence, where young Joseph and later his son Frederick did their best to recapture the magic spirit of the gathering to Zion, fighting a bland Gentile incredulity that the center of the universe should be an old-fashioned suburb of Kansas City. Nauvoo became almost a ghost city, its fine brick houses falling into ruin and its cabins decaying altogether. The communistic Icarians under Etienne Cabet revived it for a brief period, but with their departure it sank into a necroscopic lethargy which all recent Mormon attempts to make the site a shrine have only intensified. Before their departure, the Mormons, although they knew that they were shortly to abandon it, only the attic story was dedicated. But thousands of saints participated in the endowment mysteries, and then, with a sense of release, crossed the Mississippi and headed for the Oregon Trail, while Gentile mobs prepared to sack the city. Until November 1848, the temple continued to attract tourists, though no purchaser appeared in answer to Brigham Young's offer of sale. Then it was fired by an arsonist, who doubtless feared that it might one day lure the Mormons back. The gutted and partly demolished shell, described by one early traveler as the most impressive ruins in America, was purchased by the Icarians, who hoped to remodel it into a school. But before they could replace one stone upon another, a capricious tornado piled the great limestone walls into a heap of rubble, and the legend sprang up among the Mormons that God's finger had traced the tornado's path, lest desecration come to the holy place. The Mormons who followed Brigham Young continued to be temple builders, their spires and pillars rising in Utah, Idaho, Arizona, Canada, and Hawaii. No other portion of Joseph Smith's religion showed the same unbroken continuity as the temple rituals, which are even now performed with only minor changes, as they were in the Nauvoo Masonic Hall. This is not surprising, since the rites were entirely extraneous to Mormon life, but wherever the religion operated as a generative force in Mormon work and thinking, polygamy in particular underwent an astonishing evolution. From a clandestine venture limited to the leading elders of the church, it became, in the isolation of the Great Basin, an eminently respectable practice, the number of wives even symbolizing the intensity of a man's faith. And there was no more casual marrying of married women, as Joseph had done. Every man who took a plural wife assumed full responsibility for her honor, if not always for her support. Under Brigham Young, what M.R. Werner has sagely called Puritan polygamy had none of the lush sensuality of the harems of the Middle East, yet an aroused American public, fed on lurid exposés of Mormon sex life, tried for 3 decades to legislate polygamy out of existence in Mormon territory, sending the leading elders to the penitentiary like common criminals. But both the men and the women, sublimely certain of the rightness of their cause, fought the nation with astonishing tenacity. Finally, in 1890, their 4th president, Wilford Woodruff, in a manifesto intended to win statehood and peace, renounced the practice of plural marriage while retaining the principle as an ideal. 50 years later, the Mormon hierarchy, in its passion for respectability, had so turned against the principle as well as the practice that it heaped upon a tiny dissenting fundamentalist sect that revived polygamy all the self-righteous fury and abhorrence that the Gentiles had spent upon the Mormons a generation before. Polygamy, which had always been an anomaly in America, was not yet extinct. But for most Mormons, Joseph's last great revelation was merely a memory, and an embarrassing one. Joseph Smith's ideal of uniting church and state, which brought such catastrophe in Illinois, was realized under the rigorous suzerainty of Brigham Young. But by the time of his death, the pendulum had begun to swing back. The Mormons themselves broke up their political solidarity to aid in gaining statehood for Utah. A generation later, they even ignored the admonitions of their leaders, now strongly Republican, to vote in overwhelming numbers for Franklin Roosevelt. Whether knowingly or not, they had come to reject the theocratic principle of their prophet for the American tradition of democracy. What then remains of Joseph Smith in the modern Mormon Church? Most of the human qualities that endeared him to those who knew him, his jollity, kindliness, love of sport and good living, his athletic grace, and his prodigious personal charm, have been forgotten. But there remains his story, beginning with the great vision of the Father and the Son, and ending with his martyrdom, a legend without parallel in American religious history. But this legend alone is not enough to explain the vigor and tenacity of the Mormon Church. Before his death, Joseph had established an evangelical socialism in which every man worked feverishly to build the kingdom of God upon earth. This has grown into a vast pyramidal organization in which the workers finance the church, advertise it, and do everything but govern it. The Mormon people are still bent on building the kingdom of God, and everyone from the 12-year-old deacon to the 80-year-old high priest is made to feel that upon him depends the realization of that ideal. Here, as in no other church in America, the people are the church, and the church the people. It is not only work and sacrifice, but a sense of participation and responsibility that generates the steadfast Mormon loyalty. The average Mormon no longer reads the holy books of Joseph Smith, and the only revelation with which he is familiar is the injunction against the use of tobacco and alcohol. Yet he believes fervently in the doctrine of eternal progression, which of all the prophet's tenets is the most endemic to America. Every Mormon, if he thinks about it at all, believes himself to be on the road to godhood. And since, according to Joseph, a man is saved no faster than he gets knowledge, a passion for education has become one of the common denominators of Mormon culture. Joseph Smith's great zest for learning started a tradition that did not diminish with time. The glory of God is intelligence has become the most quoted of all his aphorisms, and there is no room for cynicism or fatalism in Mormon thinking. Perhaps the most vigorous tradition transmitted by Joseph Smith was the identification of God with material prosperity. The practice established at Nauvoo has been continued by the church in Utah, which controls large sections of Mormon real estate and industry. Financial wizardry has come to be looked upon as equally important with spiritual excellence among the qualifications for church leadership. But the communistic ideology that pervaded the experiments of an earlier day is vehemently disavowed. Big business has become thoroughly beatified. The religion that Joseph founded was all too well adapted to the milieu from which it sprang, the milieu of frontier America, with all its crudity as well as vigor. And the present church betrays its heritage in all its works, including the road signs which lead to its shrines. Along the lovely White River Valley of Vermont winds a highway leading to Sharon. As one approaches Joseph's birthplace, one comes upon a marker that heralds the proximity of this Bethlehem of Mormonism. Its message is too ingenuously deceptive of the true missionary spirit it embodies. Visit, it urges, the Joseph Smith Monument, world's largest polished shaft. One cannot say that the prophet has been too ill-served by this sign, for it only symbolizes the barrenness of his spiritual legacy. Joseph had a ranging fancy, a revolutionary vigor, and a genius for improvisation, and what he could mold with these he made well. With them he created a book and a religion. But he could not create a truly spiritual content for that religion. He could canalize aspirations formed elsewhere into a new structure and provide the ritualistic shell of new observances. But within the dogma of the Church there is no new Sermon on the Mount, no new saga of redemption, nothing for which Joseph himself might stand. His martyrdom was a chance event, wholly incidental to the creed that he created. Yet Joseph's theology, a patchwork of ideas and rituals drawn from every quarter, became in his hands a thing of color, warmth, and originality. Joseph believed in the good life upon earth, in work, laughter, and brotherhood. Tolerant of the foibles of his friends, since he could not easily forget his own, he provided a heaven where all men would be saved, and he made of that heaven a continuation of the good life of earth. Since work was a prerequisite to joy in this life, so should it be in the next. Since his wife and children were dear to him, he made the marriage covenant eternal and allowed for its expansion. Since power was sweet to him, he gave to every convert the promise of dominion over a star. Joseph in his own person provided a symbol of nearness to God and a finality of interpretation that made the ordinary frontier evangelist seem by comparison all sound and fury. There was a great hunger in his people, and they accepted him for what he set himself up to be. They believed the best of him, and thereby caused him to give his best. Joseph's true monument is not a granite shaft in Vermont, but a great intermountain empire in the West. Appendix A. Documents on the early life of Joseph Smith. The earliest and most important account of Joseph Smith's money digging is the following court record, first unearthed in southern New York by Daniel S. Tuttle, Episcopal Bishop of Salt Lake City, and published in the article on Mormonism in the New Schaff-Herzog Encyclopedia. New York, 1883, Volume 2, page 1576.1. The trial was held before a justice of the peace in Bainbridge, Shenango County, New York, the 20th of March, 1826. People of State of New York versus Joseph Smith. Warrant issued upon oath of Peter Bridgman, who informed that one Joseph Smith of Bainbridge was a disorderly person and an impostor. Prisoner brought into court the 20th of March, 1826. Prisoner examined. Says that he came from town of Palmyra and had been at the house of Josiah Stowell in Bainbridge most of time since. Had small part of time been employed in looking for mines, but the major part had been employed by said Stowell on his farm, and going to school, that he had a certain stone which he had occasionally looked at to determine where hidden treasures in the bowels of the earth were, that he professed to tell in this manner where gold mines were a distance underground, and had looked for Mr. Stowell several times, and informed him where he could find those treasures, and Mr. Stowell had been engaged in digging for them, that at Palmyra he pretended to tell by looking at this stone, where coined money was buried in Pennsylvania, and while at Palmyra he had frequently ascertained in that way where lost property was, of various kinds. That he has occasionally been in the habit of looking through this stone to find lost property for 3 years, but of late had pretty much given it up on account it's injuring his health, especially his eyes, made them sore, that he did not solicit business of this kind, and had always rather declined having anything to do with this business. Josiah Stowell, sworn, says that prisoner had been at his house something like 5 months, had been employed by him to work on farm part of time, that he pretended to have skill of telling where hidden treasures in the earth were, by means of looking through a certain stone. That prisoner had looked for him sometimes, once to tell him about money buried on Bend Mountain in Pennsylvania, once for gold on Monument Hill, and once for a salt spring. and that he positively knew that the prisoner could tell, and professed the art of seeing those valuable treasures through the medium of said stone, that he found the digging part at Bend and Monument Hill as prisoner represented it, that prisoner had looked through said stone for Deacon Adelon, for a mine, did not exactly find it, but got a piece of ore which resembled gold, he thinks. That prisoner had told by means of this stone where a Mr. Bacon had buried money. That he and prisoner had been in search of it, that prisoner said that it was in a certain root of a stump 5 feet from surface of the earth, and with it would be found a tail feather, that said Stowell and prisoner thereupon commenced digging, found a tail feather, but money was gone, that he supposed that money moved down, that prisoner did offer his services, that he never deceived him, that prisoner looked through stone, and described Josiah Stowell's house and outhouses, while at Palmyra, at Simpson Stowell's correctly, that he had told about a painted tree with a man's hand painted upon it, by means of said stone, that he had been in company with prisoner digging for gold, and had the most implicit faith in prisoner's skill. Horace Stowell, sworn, says he see prisoner look into hat through stone, pretending to tell where a chest of dollars were buried in Windsor a number of miles distant, marked out size of chest in the leaves on ground. Rod Stowell, sworn, says that he went to see whether prisoner could convince him that he possessed the skill that he professed to have, upon which prisoner laid a book upon a white cloth, and proposed looking through another stone which was white and transparent, hold the stone to the candle, turn his back to book, and read. The deception appeared so palpable that he went off disgusted. McMaster, sworn, says he went with Arid Stowell to be convinced of prisoner's skill, and likewise came away disgusted, finding the deception so palpable. Prisoner pretended to him that he could discern objects at a distance by holding this white stone to the sun or candle. That prisoner rather declined looking into a hat at his dark-colored stone, as he said that it hurt his eyes. Jonathan Thompson says that prisoner was requested to look 4 yeomen's 4 chest of money, did look, and pretended to know where it was, and that prisoner, Thompson, and yeomans went in search of it. That Smith arrived at spot first was in night. That Smith looked in hat while there, and when very dark, and told how the chest was situated. After digging several feet, struck upon something sounding like a board or plank. Prisoner would not look again, pretending that he was alarmed the last time that he looked, on account of the circumstances relating to the trunk being buried came all fresh to his mind. That, the last time that he looked, he discovered distinctly the 2 Indians who buried the trunk, that a quarrel ensued between them, and that one of said Indians was killed by the other, and thrown into the hole beside of the trunk, to guard it, as he supposed. Thompson says that he believes in the prisoner's professed skill, that the board which he struck his spade upon was probably the chest, but on account of an enchantment the trunk kept settling away from under them while digging, that, notwithstanding they continued constantly removing the dirt, yet the trunk kept about the same distance from them. Says prisoner said that it appeared to him that salt might be found at Bainbridge, and that he is certain that prisoner can divine things by means of said stone and hat. That, as evidence of fact, prisoner looked into his hat to tell him about some money witness lost 16 years ago, and that he described the man that witness supposed had taken it, and disposition of money. And thereupon the court finds the defendant guilty. Point 2. Between the 6th of January and the 19th of March, 1831, Obadiah Dogberry published in the Palmyra Reflector 6 articles describing the youthful Joseph Smith and his Book of Mormon. These were recently reprinted by Francis W. Kirkham in A New Witness for Christ in America, Independence, Missouri, 1942, pages 282 to 95. His long introduction and digressions into the history of various religious impostors have been omitted here. Joseph Smith Sr., the father of the personage of whom we are now writing, had by misfortune or otherwise been reduced to extreme poverty before he migrated to western New York. His family was large, consisting of 9 or 10 children, among whom Joe Jr. was the 3rd or 4th in succession. We have never been able to learn that any of the family were ever noted for much else than ignorance and stupidity, to which might be added, so far as it may respect the elder branch, a propensity to superstition and a fondness for everything marvelous. We have been credibly informed that the mother of the prophet had connected herself with several religious societies before her present illumination. This also was the case with other branches of the family, but how far the father of the prophet ever advanced in these particulars we are not precisely informed. It, however, appears quite certain that the prophet himself never made any serious pretensions to religion until his late pretended revelation. We are not able to determine whether the elder Smith was ever concerned in money-digging transactions previous to his immigration from Vermont or not, but it is a well-authenticated fact that soon after his arrival here he evinced a firm belief in the existence of hidden treasures, and that this section of country abounded in them. He also revived, or in other words, propagated the vulgar yet popular belief that these treasures were held in charge by some evil spirit, which was supposed to be either the devil himself or some one of his most trusty favorites. Article number 3, the 1st of February, 1831. In the commencement, the impostor of the Book of Mormon had no regular plan or features. At a time when the money-digging ardor was somewhat abated, the elder Smith declared that his son Joe had seen the spirit, which he then described as a little old man with a long beard, and was informed that he, Joe, under certain circumstances, eventually should obtain great treasures, and that in due time he, the spirit, would furnish him, Joe, with a book, which would give an account of the ancient inhabitants, antediluvians, of this country, and where they had deposited their substance, consisting of costly furniture, etc., at the approach of the great deluge which had ever since that time remained secure in his, the Spirit's, charge, in large and spacious chambers, in sundry places in this vicinity, and these tidings corresponded precisely with revelations made to, and predictions made by the elder Smith a number of years before. The time at length arrived when young Joe was to receive the book from the hand of the Spirit, and he repaired accordingly, alone, and in the night time, to the woods in the rear of his father's house, and met the Spirit as had been appointed. This rogue of a spirit who had baffled all the united efforts of the money-diggers, although they had tried many devices to gain his favor, and at one time sacrificed a barnyard fowl, intended, it would seem, to play our prophet a similar trick on this occasion, for no sooner had he delivered the book according to promise than he made a most desperate attempt to regain its possession. Our prophet, however, like a lad of true metal, stuck to his prize. Joe retained his treasure and returned to the house with his father, much fatigued and injured. This tale, in substance, was told at the time the event was said to have happened by both father and son, and is well recollected by many of our citizens. It will be borne in mind that no divine interposition had been dreamed of at the period. Article number 4, the 14th of February, 1831. It is well known that Joe Smith never pretended to have any communion with angels until a long period after the pretended finding of his book, and that the juggling of himself or father went no further than the pretended faculty of seeing wonders in a peepstone, and the occasional interview with the spirit supposed to have the custody of hidden treasures. And it is also equally well known that a vagabond fortune-teller by the name of Walters, who then resided in the town of Sodus, and was once committed to the jail of this county for juggling, was the constant companion and bosom friend of these money-digging impostors. There remains but little doubt, in the minds of those at all acquainted with these transactions, that Walters, who was sometimes called the Conjurer, and was paid $3 per Dalton buy for his service by the money-diggers in this neighborhood, first suggested to Smith the idea of finding a book. Walters, the better to carry on his own deception with those ignorant and deluded people who employed him, had procured an old copy of Caesar's Cicero's Orations in the Latin language, out of which he read long and loud to his credulous hearers, uttering at the same time an unintelligible jargon, which he would afterwards pretend to interpret and explain as a record of the former inhabitants of America, and a particular account of the numerous situations where they had deposited their treasures previous to their final extirpation. So far did this impostor carry this diabolical farce, that not long previous to the pretended discovery of the Book of Mormon, Walters assembled his nightly band of money-diggers in the town of Manchester, at a point designated in his magical book, and drawing a circle around laborers with the point of an old rusty sword, and using sundry other incantations, for the purpose of propitiating the spirit, absolutely sacrificed a fowl rooster in the presence of his awe-stricken wealth, and, after digging until daylight, his deluded employers retired to their several habitations, fatigued and disappointed. Article number 5, the 28th of February, 1831. In June and July 1830, the Palmyra Reflector published a parody of the Book of Mormon called The Book of Pukei, which said in part, "And it came to pass that when the mantle of Walters the magician had fallen upon Joseph, surnamed the prophet, who was the son of Joseph, that the idle and slothful gathered themselves together in the presence of Joseph, and said unto him, Lo, we will be thy servants forever. Do with us, our wives, and our little ones, as it may seem good in thine eyes. And the prophet answered and said, Behold, hath not the mantle of Walters the magician fallen upon me? And am I not able to do before you, my people, great wonders, and show you, at a more proper season, where the Nephites hid their treasure? For lo, tonight stood before me, in the wilderness of Manchester, the Spirit, who, from the beginnings, had in keeping all the treasures hidden in the bowels of the Reflector, the 7th of July, 1830.3, D.P. Hurlbut, in 1833, collected sworn statements from more than 100 of the early friends and neighbors of Joseph Smith, in the vicinities of Palmyra, New York, and Harmony, Pennsylvania. These have been largely ignored by Mormon historians." End quote. "It was simply a matter of muckraking on Hurlbut's part," wrote B.H. Roberts. "Every idle story, every dark insinuation which at that time could be thought of and unearthed, was pressed into service to gratify this man's personal desire for revenge." Comprehensive History of the Church, Volume 1, Salt Lake City, 1930, page 41. Since, however, Joseph's money-digging is well established by the previous court record and newspaper stories, Hurlbut's affidavits can hardly be dismissed by the objective student, particularly since they throw considerable light on the writing of the Book of Mormon. The following are the most significant extracts. For complete text of all the affidavits collected, see Eber D. Howe, Mormonism Unveiled, Painesville, Ohio, 1834, pages 232 to 68. I, Peter Ingersoll, first became acquainted with the family of Joseph Smith Sen in the year of our Lord, 1822. I lived in the neighborhood of said family until about 1830, during which time the following facts came under my observation. The general employment of the family was digging for money. I had frequent invitations to join the company, but always declined. The said Joseph Sr. told me that the best time for digging money was in the heat of summer, when the heat of the sun caused the chests of money to rise near the top of the ground. At another time, he told me that the ancient inhabitants of this country used camels instead of horses. For proof of this fact, he stated that in a certain hill on the farm of Mr. Kyler, there was a cave containing an immense value of gold and silver, stand of arms, also a saddle for a camel, hanging on a peg at one side of the cave. In the month of August 1827, I was hired by Joseph Smith, Jr. to go to Pennsylvania to move his wife's household furniture up to Manchester, where his wife then was. When we arrived at Mr. Hale's in Harmony, Pennsylvania, from which place he had taken his wife, a scene presented itself, truly affecting. His father-in-law, Mr. Hale, addressed Joseph in a flood of tears. "You have stolen my daughter and married her. I had much rather have followed her to her grave. You spend your time in digging for money, pretend to see in a stone, and thus try to deceive people." Joseph wept, and acknowledged he could not see in a stone now, nor never could, and that his former pretensions in that respect were all false. He then promised to give up his old habits of digging for money and looking into stones. Mr. Hale told Joseph if he would move to Pennsylvania and work for a living, he would assist him in getting into business. Joseph acceded to this proposition. I then returned with Joseph and his wife to Manchester. Joseph told me on his return that he intended to keep the promise which he had made to his father-in-law. "But," said he, "it will be hard for me, for they will all oppose, as they want me to look in the stone for them to dig money, and In fact, it was as he predicted. They urged him, day after day, to resume his old practice of looking in the stone. He seemed much perplexed as to the course he should pursue. In this dilemma he made me his confidant, and told me what daily transpired in the family of Smiths. One day he came, and greeted me with a joyful countenance. Upon asking the cause of his unusual happiness, he replied in the following language. As I was passing yesterday across the woods after a heavy shower of rain, I found in a hollow some beautiful white sand that had been washed up by the water. I took off my frock and tied up several quarts of it, and then went home. On my entering the house, I found the family at the table eating dinner. They were all anxious to know the contents of my frock. At that moment, I happened to think of what I had heard about a history found in Canada called the Golden Bible, so I very gravely told them it was the Golden Bible. To my surprise, they were credulous enough to believe what I said. Accordingly, I told them that I had received a commandment to let no one see it, for, says I, no man can see it with the naked eye and live. However, I offered to take out the book and show it to them, but they refused to see it, and left the room. Now, said Joe, I have got the damned fools fixed, and will carry out the fun. Notwithstanding, he told me he had no such book, and believed there never was any such book, yet he told me that he actually went to Willard Chase to get him to make a chest in which he might deposit his Golden Bible. But, as Chase would not do it, he made a box himself of clapboards, and put it into a pillowcase, and allowed people only to lift it and feel of it through the case. Peter Ingersoll, I, William Stafford, first became acquainted with Joseph Senator and his family in the year 1820. They lived at that time in Palmyra, about 1.5 miles from my residence. A great part of their time was devoted to digging for money, especially in the night time, when they said the money could be most easily obtained. I have heard them tell marvelous tales respecting the discoveries they had made in their peculiar occupation of money digging. They would say, for instance, that in such a place, in such a hill, on a certain man's farm, there were deposited keys, barrels, and hogsheads of coined silver and gold, bars of gold, golden images, brass kettles filled with gold and silver, gold candlesticks, swords, etc. They would say also that nearly all the hills in this part of New York were thrown up by human hands, and in them were large caves, which Joseph, Jr., could see by placing a stone of singular appearance in his hat in such a manner as to exclude all light, at which time they pretended he could see all things within and under the earth, that he could see within the above-mentioned caves, large gold bars and silver plates, that he could also discover the spirits in whose charge these treasures were, clothed in ancient dress. Old Joseph and one of the boys came to me one day and said that Joseph, Jr., had discovered some very remarkable and valuable treasures which could be procured only in one way. That way was as follows: that a black sheep should be taken on to the ground where the treasures were concealed, that, after cutting its throat, it should be led around a circle while bleeding. This being done, the wrath of the evil spirit would be appeased. The treasures could then be obtained, and my share of them was to be fourfold. To gratify my curiosity, I let them have a large fat sheep. They afterwards informed me that the sheep was killed pursuant to commandment, but as there was some mistake in the process, it did not have the desired effect. This, I believe, is the only time they ever made money digging a profitable business. William Stafford. I became acquainted with the Smith family, known as the authors of the Mormon Bible, in the year 1820. At that time, they were engaged in the money-digging business, which they followed until the latter part of the season of 18. In the year 1822, I was engaged in digging a well. I employed Alvin and Joseph Smith to assist me, the latter of whom is now known as the Mormon Prophet. After digging about 20 feet below the surface of the earth, we discovered a singularly appearing stone which excited my curiosity. I brought it to the top of the well, and, as we were examining it, Joseph put it into his hat, and then his face into the top of his hat. After obtaining the stone, he began to publish abroad what wonders he could discover by looking in it. In the month of June 1827, Joseph Smith Sr. related to me the following story: that some years ago, a certain spirit had appeared to Joseph his son in a vision, and informed him that in a certain place there was a record on plates of gold, and that he was the person that must obtain them, and this he must do in the following manner. On the 22d of September, he must repair to the place where was deposited this manuscript, dressed in black clothes and riding a black horse with a switch-tail, and demand the book in a certain name, and after obtaining it, he must go directly away, and neither lay it down nor look behind him. They accordingly fitted out Joseph with a suit of black clothes, and borrowed a black horse. He repaired to the place of deposit, and demanded the book, which was in a stone box, unsealed, and so near the top of the ground that he could see one end of it, and raising it up, took out the book of gold. But fearing someone might discover where he got it, he laid it down to place back the top stone, as he found it. And turning round, to his surprise there was no book in sight. He again opened the box, and in it saw the book, and attempted to take it out, but was hindered. He saw in the box something like a toad, which soon assumed the appearance of a man, and struck him on the side of his head. Not being discouraged at trifles, he again stooped down, and strove to take the book, when the spirit struck him again, and knocked him 3 or 4 rods, and hurt him prodigiously. After recovering from his fright, he inquired why he could not obtain the plates, to which the spirit made reply, "Because you have not obeyed your orders." He then inquired when he could have them, and was answered thus, "Come 1 year from this day, and bring with you your oldest brother, and you shall have them." This spirit, he said, was the spirit of the prophet who wrote this book, and who was sent to Joseph Smith to make known these things to him. Before the expiration of the year, his oldest brother died, which the old man said was an accidental providence. In the fore part of September, I believe, 1827, the prophet requested me to make him a chest, informing me that he designed to move back to Pennsylvania, and expecting soon to get his gold book, he wanted a chest to lock it up, giving me to understand at the same time that if I would make the chest, he would give me a share in the book. I told him my business was such that I could not make it. A few weeks after this conversation, he came to my house and related the following story: that on the 22nd of September, he arose early in the morning, and took a 1-horse wagon of someone that had stayed overnight at their house without leave or license, and, together with his wife, repaired to the hill which contained the book. He left his wife in the wagon, by the road, and went alone to the hill, a distance of 30 or 40 rods from the road. He said he then took the book out of the ground and hid it in a treetop, and returned home. He said he should think it would weigh 60 pounds, and was sure it would weigh 40. He then observed that if it had not been for that stone, which he acknowledged belonged to me, he would not have obtained the book. A few days afterwards he told one of my neighbors that he had not got any such book, nor never had such an one, but that he had told the story to deceive the damned fool, meaning me, to get him to make a chest. His neighbors having become disgusted with his foolish stories, he determined to go back to Pennsylvania to avoid what he called persecution, Willard Chase. In the early part of the winter in 1828, I made a visit to Martin Harris's, and was joined in the company by Joseph Smith, Sr., and his wife. They told me that the report that Joseph, Jr. had found golden plates was true, and that he was in Harmony Pa, translating them, that such plates were in existence, and that Joseph, Jr. was to obtain them, was revealed to him by the spirit of one of the saints that was on this continent previous to its being discovered by Columbus, old Mrs. Smith observed that she thought he must be a Quaker, as he was dressed very plain. They said that the plates he then had in possession were but an introduction to the gold Bible, that all of them upon which the Bible was written were so heavy that it would take 4 stout men to load them into a cart, that Joseph had also discovered, by looking through his stone, the vessel in which the gold was melted from which the plates were made, and also the machine with which they were rolled. He also discovered in the bottom of the vessel 3 balls of gold, each as large as his fist. The old lady said also that after the book was translated, the plates were to be publicly exhibited, admittance 25 cents. She calculated it would bring in annually an enormous sum of money. In the 2nd month following, Martin Harris and his wife were at my house. In conversation about Mormonites, she observed that she wished her husband would quit them, as she believed it was all false and a delusion. To which I heard Mr. Harris reply, "What if it is a lie? If you will let me alone, I will make money out of it." I was both an eye and ear witness of what has been stated above, which is now fresh in my memory, and I give it to the world for the good of mankind. I speak the truth and lie not, God bearing me witness. Abigail Harris. Martin Harris was once industrious, attentive to his domestic concerns, and thought to be worth about $10,000. He is naturally quick in his temper, and in his mad fits frequently abuses all who may dare to oppose him in his wishes. However strange it may seem, I have been a great sufferer by his unreasonable conduct. At different times while I lived with him, he has whipped, kicked, and turned me out of the house. About a year previous to the report being raised that Smith had found gold plates, he became very intimate with the Smith family, and said he believed Joseph could see in his stone anything he wished. After this, he apparently became very sanguine in his belief, and frequently said he would have no one in his house that did not believe in Mormonism. And because I would not give credit to the report he made about the gold plates, he became more austere towards me. In one of his fits of rage, he struck me with the butt end of a whip. Whether the Mormon religion be true or false, I leave the world to judge, for its effects upon Martin Harris have been to make him more cross, turbulent, and abusive to me. I, Joseph Caprone, became acquainted with Joseph Smith, Senator, in the year of our Lord 1827. They have, since then, been really a peculiar people, fond of the foolish and the marvelous, at one time addicted to vice and the grossest immoralities, at another time making the highest pretensions to piety and holy intercourse with Almighty God. The family of Smith held Joseph Jr. in high estimation on account of some supernatural power which he was supposed to possess. This power he pretended to have received through the medium of a stone of peculiar quality. The stone was placed in a hat, in such a manner as to exclude all light except that which emanated from the stone itself. The light of the stone, he pretended, enabled him to see anything he wished. Accordingly, he discovered ghosts, infernal spirits, mountains of gold and silver, and many other invaluable treasures deposited in the earth. He would often tell his neighbors of his wonderful discoveries, and urge them to embark in the money-digging business. The sapient Joseph discovered northwest of my house a chest of gold watches, but, as they were in the possession of the evil spirit, it required skill and stratagem to obtain them. Accordingly, orders were given to stick a parcel of large stakes in the ground, several rods around, in a circular form. This was to be done directly over the spot where the treasures were deposited. A messenger was then sent to Palmyra to procure a polished sword, after which Samuel F. Lawrence, with a drawn sword in his hand, marched around to guard any assault which his satanic majesty might be disposed to make. Meantime, the rest of the company were busily employed in digging for the watches. They worked as usual till quite exhausted, but in spite of their brave defender, Lawrence, and their bulwark of stakes, the devil came off victorious and carried away the watches. At length, Joseph pretended to find the gold plates. This scheme, he believed, would relieve the family from all pecuniary embarrassment. His father told me that when the book was published, they would be enabled, from the profits of the work, to carry into successful operation the money-digging business. He gave me no intimation at that time that the book was to be of a religious character, or that it had anything to do with revelation. He declared it to be a speculation, and said when it is completed, my family will be placed on a level above the generality of mankind. Joseph Caprone. We, the undersigned, have been acquainted with the Smith family for a number of years while they resided near this place, and we have no hesitation in saying that we consider them destitute of that moral character which ought to entitle them to the confidence of any community. They were particularly famous for visionary projects, spent much of their time in digging for money which they pretended was hid in the earth, and to this day large excavations may be seen in the earth, not far from their residence, where they used to spend their time in digging for hidden treasures. Joseph Smith Sr. and his son Joseph were in particular considered entirely destitute of moral character, and addicted to vicious habits. This statement was signed by 51 residents of Palmyra. Harmony Paw, the 10th of March, 1834. I first became acquainted with Joseph Smith, Jr. in November 1825. He was at that time in the employ of a set of men who were called money diggers, and his occupation was that of seeing, or pretending to see, by means of a stone placed in his hat, and his hat closed over his face. In this way he pretended to discover minerals and hidden treasure. His appearance at this time was that of a careless young man, not very well educated, and very saucy and insolent to his father. Smith and his father, with several other money diggers, boarded at my house while they were employed in digging for a mine that they supposed had been opened and worked by the Spaniards many years since. Young Smith gave the money diggers great encouragement at first, but when they had arrived in digging to near the place where he had stated an immense treasure would be found, he said the enchantment was so powerful that he could not see. They then became discouraged and soon after dispersed. This took place about the 17th of November, 1825, and one of the company gave me his note for $12.68 for his hoard, which is still unpaid. After these occurrences, young Smith made several visits at my house, and at length asked my consent to his marrying my daughter Emma. This I refused, and gave my reasons for so doing, some of which were that he was a stranger, and followed a business that I could not approve. He then left the place. Not long after this he returned, and while I was absent from home, carried off my daughter into the state of New York, where they were married without my approbation or consent. After they had arrived at Palmyra, NY, Emma wrote me inquiring whether she could take her property, consisting of clothing, furniture, cows, etc. I replied that her property was safe and at her disposal. In a short time they returned, bringing with them a Peter Ingersoll, and subsequently came to the conclusion that they would move out and reside upon a place near my residence. Smith stated to me that he had given up what he called glass-looking, and that he expected to work hard for a living, and was willing to do so. He also made arrangements with my son Alva Hale to go to Palmyra and move his Smith's furniture, etc., to this place. He then returned to Palmyra, and soon after, Alva, agreeable to the arrangement, went up and returned with Smith and his family. Soon after this, I was informed they had brought a wonderful box of plates down with them. I was shown a box in which it is said they were contained, which had to all appearances been used as a glass box of the common window glass. I was allowed to feel the weight of the box, and they gave me to understand that the book of plates was then in the box, into which, however, I was not allowed to look. I inquired of Joseph Smith, Jr., who was to be the first who would be allowed to see the book of plates. He said it was a young child. After this I became dissatisfied, and informed him that if there was anything in my house of that description, which I could not be allowed to see, he must take it away. If he did not, I was determined to see it. After that, the plates were said to be hid in the woods. The manner in which he pretended to read and interpret was the same as when he looked for the money diggers, with the stone in his hat, and his hat over his face, while the book of plates were at the same time hid in the woods. I conscientiously believe from the facts I have detailed, and from many other circumstances, which I do not deem it necessary to relate, that the whole Book of Mormon, so called, is a silly fabrication of falsehood and wickedness, got up for speculation, and with a design to dupe the credulous and unwary, and in order that its fabricators may live upon the spoils of those who swallow the deception. Isaac Hale. On May 11, 1946, the LDS Church in Utah published an official review of this book in the church section of the Deseret News. It denounced the 1826 court record published here, pages 405-7, as patently a fabrication of unknown authorship, and never in the court records at all. Since then, thanks to the expert detective work of Mr. Stanley Ivins, Mr. Dale L. Morgan, and Miss Helen L. Fairbank, I have collected the following data, which establish the authenticity of this record beyond any doubt. Mr. Ivins unearthed the fact that the original pages of the court record were torn out of the record book of Justice Albert Neely of Bainbridge, New York, who presided at the trial, by his niece, Miss Emily Pearsall, who was a missionary assistant to Episcopal Tuttle in Salt Lake City. For Bishop Tuttle's statement on this point, see the Utah Christian Advocate, January 1886. For biographical data on Miss Pearsall, see Clarence E. Pearsall. History and Genealogy of the Pearsall Family in England and America, 1928. The court record was first published by Charles Marshall in Fraser's Magazine, London, February 1873. Marshall had visited Salt Lake City in the spring of 1871. See also his articles on Utah in Fraser's Magazine, June and July 1871. Bishop Tuttle presented the original manuscript pages of the trial to the Utah Christian Advocate, which published them January 1886. At this point, the manuscript seems to have disappeared. There are 2 newspaper accounts of this trial published independently, each by a local Bainbridge resident. Mr. Dale L. Morgan discovered the earliest, an article titled Mormonites, in the Evangelical Magazine and Gospel Advocate, Utica, New York, the 9th of April, 1831. This was only 5 years after the trial. It is signed A.W.B., and Mr. Morgan identifies him from subsequent articles as A.W. Benton. This account will be republished in Mr. Morgan's forthcoming Mormon History. The second and more detailed description, discovered by Miss Helen L. Fairbank of the Guernsey Memorial Library, Norwich, New York, was published in the Chenango Union, Norwich, New York, May 3, 1877, page 3. It is called Joseph Smith, the Originator of Mormonism, Historical Reminiscences of the Town of Afton, and was written by Dr. W.D. Purple, a local doctor, who had been town clerk, postmaster, and county historian. Purple was an eyewitness to the trial and took notes. His account has been republished by Mormon historian Francis W. Kirkham in the enlarged 1947 edition of A New Witness for Christ in America, pages 475 ff. Kirkham faces the reality but not the implications of this document. Appendix B. The Spalding-Rigdon Theory. The Spalding-Rigdon theory of the authorship of the Book of Mormon is based on a heterogeneous assortment of letters and affidavits collected between 1833 and 1900, when heaped together without regard to chronology, as in Charles A. Shook's True Origin of the Book of Mormon, and without any consideration of the character of either Joseph Smith or Sidney Rigdon. They seem impressive. But the theory is based, first of all, on the untenable assumption that Joseph Smith had neither the wit nor the learning to write the Book of Mormon, and it disregards the fact that the style of the Book of Mormon is identical with that of the Mormon prophets' later writings, such as the Doctrine and Covenants and Pearl of Great Price, but is completely alien to the turgid rhetoric of Rigdon's sermons. Protagonists of the theory do not explain why, if Rigdon wrote the Book of Mormon, he was content to let Joseph Smith found the Mormon Church and hold absolute dominion over it throughout the years, so secure in his position that he several times threatened Rigdon with excommunication when Rigdon opposed his policies. But most important, there is no good evidence to show that Rigdon and Smith ever met before Rigdon's conversion late in 1830. There is, on the contrary, abundant proof that between September 1827 and June 1829, when the Book of Mormon was being written, Rigdon was a successful Campbellite preacher in northern Ohio who, if conniving secretly with Joseph Smith 300 miles east, was so accomplished a deceiver that none of his intimate friends ever entertained the slightest suspicion of it. The Spalding theory was not born until 1833, 4 years after the Book of Mormon was completed. In June 1833, Philastus Hurlbut was excommunicated from the Mormon Church in Kirtland, Ohio. Shortly afterward, he learned that some citizens of Canode, Ohio, had detected in the Book of Mormon a resemblance to an old manuscript written more than 20 years earlier by Solomon Spalding, a Dartmouth College graduate and ex-preacher who had hoped to publish it and solve his financial embarrassments. Hurlbut interviewed these people in August and September 1833. They told him that Spalding, now deceased, had lived in Conneaut from 1809 to 1812, and that he had written a historical novel about the American Aborigines from which he had occasionally read them extracts. Spalding had moved to Pennsylvania, where he died in 1816. From Solomon Spalding's brother, John, Hurlbut obtained an affidavit, of which the significant portion read as follows. I made him a visit in 1813 and found that he had failed and was considerably involved in debt. He told me that he had been writing a book, which he intended to have printed, the avails of which he thought would enable him to pay all his debts. The book was entitled The Manuscript Found, of which he read to me many passages. It was an historical romance of the first settlers of America, endeavoring to show that the American Indians are the descendants of the Jews, or the lost tribes. It gave a detailed account of their journey from Jerusalem by land and sea till they arrived in America under the command of Nephi and Lehi. They afterwards had quarrels and contentions, and separated into two distinct nations, one of which he denominated Nephites, and the other Lamanites. Cruel and bloody wars ensued, in which great multitudes were slain. They buried their dead in large heaps, which caused the mounds so common in this country. Their arts, sciences, and civilization were brought into view, in order to account for all the curious antiquities found in various parts of North and South America. I have recently read the Book of Mormon, and to my great surprise I find nearly the same historical matter, names, etc., as they were in my brother's writings. I well remember that he wrote in the old style, and commenced about every other sentence with, "And it came to pass," or "Now it came to pass," the same as in the Book of Mormon, and, according to the best by what means it has fallen into the hands of Joseph Smith, Jr., I am unable to determine. John Spalding. Martha, wife of John Spalding, corroborated her husband's account. I was personally acquainted with Solomon Spalding about 20 years ago. It was at his house a short time before he left Conneaut. He was then writing a historical novel founded upon the first settlers of America. He represented them as an enlightened and warlike people. He had for many years contended that the aborigines of America were the descendants of some of the lost tribes of Israel, and this idea he carried out in the book in question. The lapse of time which has intervened prevents my recollecting but few of the leading incidents of his writings. But the names of Nephi and Lehi are yet fresh in my memory, as being the principal heroes of his tale. They were officers of the company which first came off from Jerusalem. He gave a particular account of their journey, by land and sea, till they arrived in America, after which disputes arose between the chiefs, which caused them to separate into different bands, one of which was called Lamanites, and the other Nephites. Between these were recounted tremendous battles, which frequently covered the ground with the slain, and their being buried in large heaps was the cause of the numerous mounds in the country. Some of these people he represented as being very large. I have read the Book of Mormon, which has brought fresh to my recollection the writings of Solomon Spalding, and I have no manner of doubt that the historical part of it is the same that I read and heard read more than 20 years ago. The old, obsolete style, and the phrases of "and it came to pass," etc., are the same. Martha Spalding. 6 of Spalding's neighbors made additional statements, of which the most important extracts are given below. I formed a co-partnership with Solomon Spalding for the purpose of rebuilding a forge. He very frequently read to me from a manuscript which he was writing, which was entitled The Manuscript Found. This book represented the American Indians as the descendants of the lost tribes, gave an account of their leaving Jerusalem, their contentions and wars, which were many and great. One time, when he was reading to me the tragic account of Laban, I pointed out to him what I considered an inconsistency, which he promised to correct. But by referring to the Book of Mormon, I find to my surprise that it stands there just as he read it to me then. Some months ago I borrowed the Golden Bible. I was astonished to find the same passages in it that Spalding had read to me more than 20 years before, from his Manuscript Found. Since that time I have more fully examined the said Golden Bible, and have no hesitation in saying that the historical part of it is principally, if not wholly, taken from the Manuscript Found. I well recollect telling Mr. Spalding that the so frequent use of the words "and it came to pass," "now it came to pass," rendered it ridiculous. I boarded and lodged in the family of said Spalding for several months. I was soon introduced to the manuscripts of Spalding, and perused them as often as I had leisure. He had written 2 or 3 books or pamphlets on different subjects, but that which more particularly drew my attention was one which he called the Manuscript Found. From this he would frequently read some humorous passages to the company present. It purported to be the history of the first settlement of America, before discovered by Columbus. He brought them off from Jerusalem under their leaders, detailing their travels by land and water, their manners, customs, laws, wars, etc. He said that he designed it as an historical novel. I have recently examined the Book of Mormon and find in it the writings of Solomon Spaulding from beginning to end, but mixed up with scripture and other religious matter, which I did not meet with in the manuscript found. Many of the passages in the Mormon book are verbatim from Spaulding, and others in part. The names of Nephi, Lehi, Moroni, and in fact all the principal names, are brought fresh to my recollection by the Gold Bible. When Spaulding divested his history of its fabulous names by a verbal explanation, he landed his people near the Straits of Darien. They were marched about the country for a length of time, in which great wars and great bloodshed ensued. He brought them across North America in a northeast direction. John and Miller. I first became acquainted with Solomon Spaulding in 1809 or 10, when he commenced building a forge on Conneaut Creek. When at his house one day, he showed and read to me a history he was writing of the lost tribes of Israel, purporting that they were the first settlers of America and that the Indians were their descendants. Upon this subject we had frequent conversations. He traced their journey from Jerusalem to America as it is given in the Book of Mormon, excepting the religious matter. The historical part of the Book of Mormon I know to be the same as I read and heard read from the writings of Spaulding more than 20 years ago. The names more especially are the same without any alteration. Spaulding had many other manuscripts, which I expect to see when Smith translates his other plate. In conclusion, I will observe that the names of and most of the historical part of the Book of Mormon were as familiar to me before I read it as most modern history. Aaron Wright. All his leisure hours were occupied in writing a historical novel founded upon the first settlers of this country. He said he intended to trace their journey from Jerusalem by land and sea till their arrival in America, give an account of their arts, sciences, civilization, wars, and contentions. In this way he would give a satisfactory account of all of the old mounds so common to this country. During the time he was at my house, I read and heard read 100 pages or more. Nephi and Lehi were by him represented as leading characters when they first started for America. Their main object was to escape the judgments which they supposed were coming upon the old world, but no religious matter was introduced as I now recollect. When I heard the historical part of it, the Book of Mormon related, I at once said it was the writings of old Solomon Spaulding. Soon after I obtained the book, and on reading it, found much of it the same as Spaulding had written more than 20 years before. Oliver Smith. I have lately read the Book of Mormon, and believe it to be the same as Spaulding wrote, except the religious part. He told me that he intended to get his writings published in Pittsburgh, Nahum Howard. The following is from the unsigned statement of Artemus Cunningham. Before showing me his manuscripts, he went into a verbal relation of its outlines, saying that it was a fabulous or romantic history of the first settlement of this country, and as it purported to have been a record found buried in the earth or in a cave, he had adopted the ancient or scripture style of writing. He then presented his manuscripts, when we sat down and spent a good share of the night in reading them and conversing upon them. I well remember the name of Nephi, which appeared to be the principal hero of the story. The frequent repetition of the phrase, I, Nephi, I recollect as distinctly as though it was but yesterday, although the general features of the story have passed from my memory through the. He attempted to account for the numerous antiquities which are found upon this continent, and remarked that, after this generation had passed away, his account of the first inhabitants of America would be considered as authentic as any other history. The Mormon Bible I have partially examined, and am fully of the opinion that Solomon Spaulding had written its outlines before he left Conneaut. All these affidavits were published in Howe's Mormonism Unveiled, pages 278 to 87. It can clearly be seen that the affidavits were written by Hurlbut, since the style is the same throughout. It may be noted also that although 5 out of the 8 had heard Spaulding's story only once, there was a surprising uniformity in the details they remembered after 22 years. 6 recalled the names Nephi, Lamanite, etc. 6 held that the manuscript described the Indians as descendants of the lost 10 tribes. 4 mentioned that the great wars caused the erection of the Indian mounds, and 4 noted the ancient scriptural style. The very tightness with which Hurlbut here was implementing his theory rouses an immediate suspicion that he did a little judicious prompting. However, the affidavits were arresting, and Hurlbut knew it. He visited Spalding's widow in Massachusetts and offered her half the profits for permission to publish the manuscript. She told him that Spalding had a great variety of manuscripts and recollected that one was entitled The Manuscript Found, but of its contents she had no distinct knowledge. During the 2 years she had lived in Pittsburgh, Spalding had taken the manuscript to the office of Patterson and Lambden, she said, but whether or not it had been returned was uncertain. Mormonism Unveiled, page 287. She gave Hurlbut permission to examine Spalding's papers in the attic of a farmhouse in Otsego County, New York. But he found there only one manuscript, which was clearly not the source for the Book of Mormon. This was a romance, supposedly translated from 24 rolls of parchment covered with Latin found in a cave on the banks of Conneaut Creek. It was written in modern English and was about 45,000 words long, 1/6 the length of the Book of Mormon. It was an adventure story of some Romans sailing to Britain before the Christian era who had been blown to America during a violent storm. Hurlbut showed this manuscript to Spalding's neighbors, who, he said, recognized it as Spalding's, but stated that it was not the manuscript found. Spalding had altered his first plan of writing by going farther back with dates and writing in the Old Scripture style, in order that it might appear more ancient. This surmise may have been true, though there was no signed statement swearing to it. But it seems more likely that these witnesses had so come to identify the Book of Mormon with the Spalding manuscript that they could not concede having made an error without admitting to a case of memory substitution which they did not themselves recognize. Hurlbut, at least, was certain that Spalding had written a second manuscript. Ever D. Howe, Hurlbut's collaborator, now wrote to Robert Patterson, the Pittsburgh printer mentioned by Spalding's widow. He replied that he had no recollection of any manuscript being brought there for publication. Neither would he have been likely to have seen it, as the business of printing was conducted wholly by Lambden at that time. Mormonism Unveiled, page 289. The partnership of Patterson and Lambden had not in fact been formed until the 1st of January, 1818, 2 years after Spalding's death. Robert Patterson, Jr., who wrote the Book of Mormon, Philadelphia, 1882, page 7. Disappointed in this source, and unable to get any confirming evidence from Joseph's neighbors in western New York, Hurlbut had to be content with insinuating that Sidney Rigdon, who had once lived in Pittsburgh, was somehow responsible for getting the Spalding manuscript into Joseph Smith's hands. Howe now purchased Hurlbut's affidavits for $500 and published them in his Mormonism Unveiled. At once the Mormons challenged Howe to produce the Spalding manuscript, but he did not even produce the one Hurlbut had uncovered, which shortly disappeared. Some writers insinuated that Hurlbut had sold it to the Mormons for a fabulous sum. Actually, it lay buried in Howe's files, which were later inherited by L. L. Rice, who followed Howe as editor of the Painesville Telegraph. Rice eventually went to Honolulu, and there discovered the manuscript among his papers. He forwarded it to Joseph H. Fairchild, president of Oberlin College, who placed it in the college library. The manuscript contained a certificate of its identity, signed by Hurlbut, Wright, Miller, and others, and bore the penciled inscription "Manuscript Story" on the outside. Its discovery was jubilantly hailed by the Mormons, who held that the Spalding theory was now proved groundless. The manuscript was first published by the Reorganized Church in Lamoni, Iowa in 1885. Many writers, however, still believe that a second Spalding manuscript was the true source of the Book of Mormon, and labored indefatigably to prove it. Before examining their evidence, it should be noted that if, as seems most likely, there was only one Spalding manuscript, there were certain similarities between it and the Book of Mormon which, though not sufficient to justify the thesis of common authorship, might have given rise to the conviction of Spalding's neighbors that one was a plagiarism of the other. Both were said to have come from out of the earth. Both were stories of colonists sailing from the Old World to the New. Both explained the earthworks and mounds common to western New York and Ohio as the result of savage wars. John Miller had spoken of humorous passages in Spalding's work, which would certainly apply to the manuscript story, but not to the utterly humorless Book of Mormon. Other features like the scriptural style, the expression "it came to pass," and the proper names seemed too definite to be questioned. But it should be remembered, as President Fairchild pointed out in his analysis of the problem, that the Book of Mormon was fresh in their minds, and their recollections of the manuscript found were very remote and dim. That under the pressure and suggestion of Hurlbut and Howe, they should put the ideas at hand in place of those remote and forgotten, and imagine that they remembered what they had recently read, would be only an ordinary example of the frailty of memory. Solomon Spaulding in the Book of Mormon. Western Reserve Historical Society, Tract Number 77, Volume 3, the 23rd of March, 1886, pages 197-8. It is significant that 5 of Hurlbut's witnesses were careful to accept the religious matter of the Book of Mormon as not contained in the Spaulding manuscript, and the others stated that the historical parts were derived from the Spaulding. The narrative Hurlbut found had no religious matter whatever, but the Book of Mormon was permeated with religious ideas. It was first and foremost a religious book. The theology could not have been wrought by interpolation, since practically every historical event was motivated either by Satan or the Lord. If, on the other hand, Hurlbut was right and there were actually 2 Spaulding manuscripts, one might reasonably expect stylistic similarities between the Book of Mormon and the extant manuscript, since the latter was full of unmistakable literary mannerisms of the kind that are more easily acquired than shed. Spaulding was heir to all the florid sentiment and grandiose rhetoric of the English Gothic romance. He used all the stereotyped patterns: villainy versus innocent maidenhood, thwarted love, and heroic valor thickly encrusted with the tradition of the noble savage. The Book of Mormon had but one scant reference to a love affair, and its rhythmical, monotonous style bore no resemblance to the cheap clichés and purple metaphors abounding in the Spaulding story. After the publication of Howe's book, affidavits popped up here and there, usually solicited by preachers anxious to discredit Joseph Smith. The Mormons replied with books and pamphlets of their own, such as Parley P. Pratt's Mormonism Unveiled in 1838 and Benjamin Winchester's The Origin of the Spaulding Story in 1840. Winchester quoted another of Spaulding's neighbors, one Jackson, who had read Spaulding's manuscript and maintained that there was no agreement between them, for, said he, Mr. Spaulding's manuscript was a very small work, in the form of a novel, saying not one word about the children of Israel, but professed to give an account of a race of people who originated from the Romans, which Mr. Spaulding said he had translated from a Latin parchment that he had found. Spaulding's widow was visited again in 1839, when she was 70 years old, by a preacher named D.R. Austin, who published her signed statement in the Boston Recorder on the 19th of April of that year. She showed an astonishing enlargement of memory over her previous statement to Hurlbut, relating that the historical romance written by her husband had been given to his acquaintance and friend Robert Patterson, who was very much pleased with it and promised to print it. She stated also that Sidney Rigdon was connected with the press at this time and had every opportunity to copy the manuscript. Rigdon's angry denial was published in the Boston Recorder on May 27, 1839. If I were to say that I ever heard of the Reverend Solomon Spaulding and his hopeful wife until Dr. P. Hurlbut wrote his lie about me, I should be a liar like unto themselves. Why was not the testimony of Mr. Patterson obtained to give force to this shameful tale of lies? The only reason is that he was not a fit tool for them to work with. 2 Mormons, Jesse and John Haven, now interviewed Spaulding's widow, who denied having written the letter, and stated that Austin had merely asked her a few questions, taken notes, and apparently written the letter himself. This interview was published in the Quincy, Illinois Whig, and later in George Reynolds' The Myth of the Manuscript Found, Salt Lake, 1883, pages 21-2. Both Spaulding's widow and daughter admitted in this interview that the manuscript they knew was an idolatrous, not a religious story. When Spaulding's daughter was 74 years old, she was interviewed, and stated that she remembered vividly hearing her father read his manuscript aloud, although she was only 6 years old at the time. Some of the names that he mentioned while reading to these people I have never forgotten. They are as fresh to me as though I heard them yesterday. They were Mormon, Maronite, Nephi. One is led to doubt the reliability of this memory, however, by another statement in this interview. In that city, Pittsburgh, my father had an intimate friend named Patterson, and I frequently visited Mr. Patterson's library with him, and heard my father talk about books with him. Patterson, it will be remembered, denied knowing Spalding at all. Spalding's daughter remembered seeing the manuscript in her father's trunk after his death, and stated that she had handled it and seen the names she had heard read to her at the age of 6. She admitted, however, that she had not read it. See statement of Mrs. M.S. McKinstry, Matilda Spalding, in Ellen E. Dickinson, The Book of Mormon, Scribner's Monthly, August 1880. If the evidence pointing to the existence of a second Spalding manuscript is dubious, the affidavits trying to prove that Rigdon stole it or copied it are all unconvincing and frequently preposterous. First, there is no evidence that Rigdon ever lived in Pittsburgh until 1822, when he became pastor of the First Baptist Church. Robert Patterson, Jr., son of the Pittsburgh printer, conducted an exhaustive research among the old settlers of the vicinity to try to establish the truth of the Spalding theory. This was in 1882, 66 years after Spalding's death. Many were familiar with the theory and believed it, he said, but few could give first-hand information. Rigdon's brother-in-law, not a Mormon, and Isaac King, an old neighbor, swore to him that Rigdon did not go to Pittsburgh before 1822. Mrs. Lambdin, widow of Patterson's partner, denied any knowledge of Rigdon, as did Robert P. Du Bois, who had worked in the printing shop between 1818 and 1820. One woman, who had worked as mail clerk in Patterson's office between 1811 and 1816, stated that she knew Rigdon and that he was an intimate friend of Lambdin's, but that this was clearly untrue is evidenced by the statement of Lambdin's widow that she had never heard of Rigdon. Another old settler claimed that Spalding told him the manuscript had been spirited away and that Rigdon was suspect, but this statement is in conflict not only with the facts of Rigdon's life, but also with the accounts of Spalding's wife and daughter, who made no mention of a lost manuscript and held that the manuscript found had been carefully preserved in the trunk. For texts of all these statements, see Robert Patterson, who wrote the Book of Mormon. Patterson Sr. never left any statement that incriminated Rigdon, although the two men knew each other casually in Pittsburgh after 1822. In the 1870s and 188s, when anti-Mormonism was most bitter in the United States, there was a great outcropping of affidavits such as those solicited by the younger Patterson. All were from citizens who vaguely remembered meeting Spalding or Rigdon some 50, 60, or 70 years earlier. All are suspect because they corroborate only the details of the first handful of documents collected by Hurlbut and frequently use the very same language. Some are outright perjury. James Jeffries wrote on the 20th of January, 1884, 40 years ago I was in business in St. Louis. I knew Sidney Rigdon. He told me several times that there was in the office with which he was connected, in Ohio, a manuscript of the Reverend Spalding, tracing the origin of the Indians from the lost tribes of Israel. The manuscript was in the office several years. He was familiar with it. Spalding wanted it published, but had not the means to pay for the printing. He, Rigdon, said Joseph Smith used to look over the manuscript and read it on Sundays. Rigdon said Smith took the manuscript and said, "I'll print it," and went off to Palmyra, New York. Weil, Mormon Portraits, page 241. 40 years previous to 1884 would have been the year of Smith's assassination. Rigdon never lived in St. Louis, nor did Joseph Smith ever visit Ohio before 1831. The tenuous chain of evidence accumulated to support the Spalding-Rigdon theory breaks altogether when it tries to prove that Rigdon met Joseph Smith before 1830. There are ambiguous references to a mysterious stranger said to have visited the Smiths between 1827 and 1830, but only two men ever claimed that this was actually Rigdon. Abel Chase, on May 2, 1879, 52 years after the event, stated that in 1827, as near as I can recollect, when he was a boy of 12 or 13, he saw a stranger at the Smith home who was said to be Rigdon. With Edem, page 230. And Lorenzo Saunders, on the 28th of January, 1885, 58 years after the event, stated that he had seen him in the spring of 1827 and again in the summer of 1828. Shook True Origin of the Book of Mormon, page 132. Yet Saunders himself admitted his recollection came only after 30 years of puzzling over the matter and hunting for evidence. See his unpublished affidavit in the Library of the Reorganized Church. And it is highly probable that both men were actually remembering Rigdon's first appearance in Palmyra in late 1830. No other of Joseph's neighbors ever made any effort to connect the Ohio preacher with the Book of Mormon events. And an early historian of western New York, writing in 1854, said, "It is believed by all those best acquainted with the Smith family and most conversant with all the Gold Bible movements, that there is no foundation for the statement that the original manuscript was written by a Mr. Turner." History of the Pioneer Settlement of Phelps and Gorham's Purchase, page 214. Rigdon's life between 1826 and 1829 has been carefully documented from non-Mormon sources. It is clear from the following chronology that he was a busy and successful preacher and one of the leading figures in the Campbellite movement in Ohio. Until August 1830, when he broke with Alexander Campbell over the question of introducing communism into the Campbellite Church, he was one of the 4 key men of that church. It cannot be held that Rigdon rewrote the Spalding manuscript before 1827, since the anti-Masonry permeating the book clearly stemmed from the Morgan excitement beginning late in 1826, activities of Rigdon, the 2nd of November 1826, the 14th of November, 1830-1826, the 2nd of November, marriage of Smith and Giles, performed by Rigdon, the 13th of December. Above marriage, recorded .1827. January, held meeting at Mantua, Ohio. February, funeral of Hannah Tanner, Chester, Ohio. March, held meeting at Mentor, Ohio. April, held meeting at Mentor, Ohio. Gap of possibly 1 month and a half, the 5th of June, marriage of Freeman and Waterman. The 15th of June, baptized Thomas Clapp at Mentor, Ohio. The 3rd of July, marriage of Gray and Kerr. The 12th of July, above marriage recorded. The 19th of July, marriage of Snow and Parker. The 10th of August, above marriage recorded. The 23rd of August, met with Mahoning Association, New Lisbon, Ohio. Gap of 1 month and a half, the 9th of October, marriage of Sherman and Matthews, the 20th of October, at Ministerial Council, Warren, Ohio. The 27th of October, marriage of Sherman and Matthews, recorded November. Held meeting at New Lisbon, Ohio, the 6th of December, marriage of Waite and Gunn, the 12th of December, above. The 13th of December, marriage of Cottrell and Olds, .1828. The 8th of January, above marriage recorded. The 14th of February, marriage of Harrington and Corning. The 31st of March, above marriage recorded. March, instructed theological class, Mentor, Ohio. March, visited Walter Scott at Warren, Ohio. May met Campbell at Shalersville, Ohio. June, baptized H. Clapp, Mentor, Ohio. Gap of possibly 2 months, August, at Association, Warren, Ohio. The 7th of September, marriage of Dill and Kent. The 18th of September, marriage of Corning and Wilson. The 13th of October, above marriages recorded. Gap of possibly 2 months and a half, 1829. The 1st of January, marriage of Churchill and Fosdick. The 1st of February, marriage of Root and Tuttle. The 12th of February, above marriage recorded. March, meeting at Mentor, Ohio. The 12th of April, meeting at Kirtland, Ohio. May, baptized Lyman White. Gap of possibly 1 month and a half, the 1st of July. Organized church at Perry, Ohio. August, baptized Mrs. Lyman White. The 7th of August, met with church in Perry, Ohio. The 13th of August, marriage of Strong and Moore. The 14th of September, above marriage recorded. The 14th of September, marriage of Atwater and Clapp. September, held meeting at Mentor, Ohio. The 1st of October, marriage of Roberts and Bates. The 7th of October, last 2 marriages recorded. October, at Perry, Ohio. November, held meeting at Waite Hill, Ohio. The 31st of December, marriage of Chandler and Johnson, .1830, the 12th of January, above marriage recorded. Gap of possible 2 months, March, at Mentor, Ohio. gap of 2 months, June at Mentor, Ohio. July, held meeting at Pleasant Valley, Ohio. August, met Campbell at Austintown, Ohio. Gap of 2.5 months, the 4th of November. Marriage of Wood and Cleveland. The 11th of November, above marriage, recorded. The 14th of November, Rigdon Bapt. The above chronology is a rearrangement of one compiled by the Reorganized Church and appearing in the Journal of History, Volume 3, pages 16 to 20, with additional information from Hayden, Early History of the Disciples in the Western Reserve. Alexander Campbell, who knew Rigdon intimately, described his conversion to Mormonism with great regret in the Millennial Harbinger, attributing it to his nervous spasms and swoonings and to his passionate belief in the imminent gathering of Israel. But of the authorship of the Book of Mormon he wrote bluntly, "It is as certainly Smith's fabrication as Satan is the father of lies, or darkness is the offspring of night." Volume 2, 1831, pages 95-100. Rigdon denied the Spalding story throughout his life. When his son John questioned him shortly before his death, he replied, "My son, I can swear before high heaven that what I have told you about the origin of that book is true. Your mother and sister, Mrs. Athalia Robinson, were present when that book was handed to me in Mentor, Ohio, and all I ever knew about the origin of that book was that Parley Pratt, Oliver Cowdery, Joseph Smith, and the witnesses who claim they saw the plates have told me, and in all my intimacy with Joseph Smith he never told me but one story, and that was that he found it engraved upon gold plates in a hill near Palmyra, New York, and that an angel had appeared to him and directed him where to find it. Life of Sidney Rigdon, by his son Rigdon, Mississippi, as quoted in B. H. Roberts' Comprehensive History of the Church, Volume 1, pages 234-5.